Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still can't believe what we saw that night in January 1980. It's been over 40 years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. The way my stomach dropped when I realized what we were looking at. I've never told many people about this because most would just think I'm crazy or making it all up. But I know what I saw. I was 22 back then, living in a small town near White Mountain in Maine. It was me, Tyler, and Connor. We'd been friends since high school. We were the kind of guys who were always looking for something to do, especially during those long Maine winters when there wasn't much happening. That particular night in January was brutally cold. A snowstorm had been forecast, but we were young and stupid and decided to go for a drive anyway. It was my truck, an old Ford F-150 that I'd saved up for working at my uncle's hardware store. We'd spent the evening at Tyler's place playing cards and drinking beers. Not me, though, I was driving. And around midnight, Connor suggested we go for a drive up toward the lake. "You guys see the weather outside?" I remember saying. The snow was already coming down pretty hard. Tyler just shrugged. "Your truck can handle it, Jason. Besides, nobody's going to be out there. We'll have the whole place to ourselves." That was enough to convince me, I guess. The idea of being the only ones out there in the wilderness had a certain appeal. So we bundled up, heavy coats, gloves, boots, and piled into my truck. The heater was working overtime, but it was still freezing. I remember the windows kept fogging up, and Connor kept wiping them with his sleeve so I could see. We took the old logging road that winds up past White Mountain toward the lake. It's remote, like really remote. The houses get fewer and farther between until there's just nothing but trees and darkness. The snowfall was getting heavier by the minute, big fat flakes swirling in the headlights, and my windshield wipers were struggling to keep up. By the time we reached the really isolated stretch, must have been around 1:30 in the morning, nobody was talking much anymore. The roads were getting bad. My tires kept slipping a bit on the fresh snow, and I was starting to think maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. The forest was dense on both sides of the narrow road, the trees made darker by the contrast with the white snow. The only sound was the rumble of the engine and the rhythmic swish of the wipers. The radio had gone to static ages ago. No stations reach out there. "Maybe we should head back," I said, peering through the windshield at the endless tunnel of white. But then, Connor leaned forward from the back seat. "Hold up, what's that?" I slowed down, squinting. There was something in the road ahead, visible in the headlights. At first, I thought maybe it was a branch that had fallen, or some debris blown onto the road by the wind. But as we got closer, it became clear that we were looking at a line of indentations in the snow, crossing the road from one side to the other. "Stop the truck," Tyler said, and I did. We sat there for a minute, engine idling, just staring through the windshield at whatever was in front of us. "Who the hell would be out here walking in this?" Connor said, what we were all thinking. The nearest house was miles away. There were no cars parked alongside the road. Nobody in their right mind would be hiking in these conditions, especially not at this hour. "Let's check it out," Tyler said, already opening his door. "Are you crazy?" I remember saying. "It's freezing out there." But curiosity got the better of me too. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment. Thank God I always kept it there, and we all got out of the truck. The cold hit me like a physical blow. The snow was coming down hard, collecting on my shoulders and hair the instant I stepped outside. The wind was whipping through the trees, making an eerie whistling sound that sent chills up my spine, that had nothing to do with the temperature. We approached the tracks cautiously. I shined my flashlight down at them, and right away, I knew something was wrong. These weren't normal footprints. They were huge, way too big to belong to any person. And they were spaced far apart, like whatever made them had been taking massive strides. "Holy shit," Tyler whispered, crouching down next to one of the prints. "Look at the size of these things." I knelt beside him, my heart starting to beat faster. The print was clearly a foot, 5 toes, a heel, an arch, but it had to be at least 16 inches long, maybe more. The depth of the impression suggested whatever left it was incredibly heavy. "This isn't human," I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. "No way." Connor was standing a few feet away, looking nervously up and down the road. "Guys, let's go," he said. "I don't like this." But Tyler and I were transfixed. I reached out and put my hand next to the print for comparison. My hand looked tiny beside it, and there was something about the shape. It was like a human foot, but wider, with toes that seemed more spread out. "Bigfoot," Tyler said suddenly. He wasn't joking. His face was deadly serious in the beam of the flashlight. "These are Bigfoot tracks." I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was being ridiculous, but I couldn't, because deep down, I knew he was right. What else could leave prints like these? A bear walks on all fours. A moose doesn't have feet shaped like this. There was no rational explanation. My mind went to all the stories I'd heard growing up, tales told around campfires about the creature that supposedly roamed the forests of Maine. I'd always thought they were just stories, myths to scare kids and tourists. But staring at those tracks in the snow, I wasn't so sure anymore. "Let's follow them," Tyler said, standing up. "See where they go." "Are you insane?" Connor hissed. "If that thing is real, I don't want to meet it." I was torn. Part of me was terrified, but another part, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, to adventure, was intrigued. "Let's at least see which way it went," I said finally. "We'll stay in the truck." We piled back in, and I turned the truck around to face the direction the tracks were heading. I drove slowly, following the line of footprints in my headlights. They continued straight down the middle of the road for a few hundred yards. Nobody spoke. The only sound was our breathing and the rumble of the engine. Then, abruptly, the tracks veered off the road and up a steep embankment into the trees. "Keep going," Tyler urged. "I can't drive up there," I said. The embankment was too steep, too densely wooded. "Then we'll go on foot," he said, reaching for the door handle. "No way," Connor and I said in unison. We argued about it for a minute, but eventually Tyler relented. Truth be told, I think he was just as scared as we were. He just didn't want to admit it. I was about to turn the truck around when Connor suddenly grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all went silent, listening. At first, all I could hear was the wind and the engine, but then there was something else, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a low, rumbling groan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. "Start driving," Connor said, his voice tight with fear. "Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I hit the gas, not caring anymore about the slippery road. The truck fishtailed briefly before the tires found purchase, and then we were moving faster than was safe in those conditions. But none of us cared. I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees behind us, but there was nothing there except swirling snow and darkness. We'd gone maybe half a mile when Tyler suddenly shouted, "Stop!" I slammed on the brakes, the truck sliding slightly before coming to a halt. "What? What is it?" "Look," he said, pointing out his window into the trees. I leaned over, trying to see what he was pointing at. At first I didn't see anything, but then something moved among the trees, something large. It was just a shadow, a darker patch against the darkness. But it was moving, and it was tall, far taller than a man. "Oh my God," I whispered. For a brief moment, the shadow seemed to pause. I had the terrible feeling that it was looking at us, aware of our presence. Then it moved again, disappearing deeper into the forest. Go, go, go! Connor was practically yelling from the back seat. I floored it, the truck's engine roaring as we tore down the road. Nobody spoke until we hit the Maine highway, nearly 15 minutes later. Only then did I ease up on the gas, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Did you guys see that? Tyler finally broke the silence. Tell me you saw that. I saw something, I admitted. My mouth was dry, my heart still racing. I don't know what it was, but it was big. It was him, Tyler said. Bigfoot, it had to be. Connor hadn't said a word. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him staring out the window, his face pale. Connor, you okay? He shook his head slightly. That sound, he said. That wasn't natural. We drove back to town in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I dropped them off at their places and we agreed to talk about it the next day when we'd had some time to process what we'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those massive footprints in the snow and that shadow moving between the trees. I kept hearing that strange, groaning sound echoing in my head. The next day, we met up at the local diner. We were all exhausted, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. So what do we do now? Connor asked, staring into his coffee. We go back, Tyler said immediately. In daylight, bring a camera, maybe try to cast one of those footprints. I shook my head. I don't know, man. Whatever that thing was, maybe we should just leave it alone. But Tyler was insistent, and eventually he wore us down. 2 days later, when the storm had passed, we drove back out to that same stretch of road. Except there was nothing to find. Fresh snow had fallen, covering any tracks that might have been there. We searched the area where we'd seen the shadow in the woods, but there was no sign that anything unusual had passed through. Over the years, I've gone back to that spot many times, always hoping to find some evidence, some confirmation that what we saw was real. I never have. Tyler moved away a few years later, heading out west for work. Connor still lives in town, but he doesn't like to talk about that night. Sometimes I wonder if he's convinced himself it never happened, but I know what I saw. Those footprints were real. That shadow moving through the trees was real. That sound, that horrible, unnatural sound, was real. I read about Bigfoot sightings sometimes, reports from all over the country of strange creatures spotted in remote areas. Most people treat these stories as jokes, as tall tales told by attention seekers or people who've had too much to drink. But I don't laugh. I believe them. Because on a snowy night in January 1980, I saw something in the woods of White Mountain that I can't explain. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. And I've never been able to forget it. I still drive that road sometimes, especially late at night when there's nobody else around. I never turn off my high beams. And I never ever stop to investigate strange shapes in the snow. Story 2. I still get chills thinking about what happened that day in August of '81. I've never been comfortable talking about it, but maybe writing it down will help me process it. I was 16 back then, living in a small town in Piscataquis County, Maine. It wasn't much, but we had miles of forest and not much else. Perfect for hunting, fishing, and just being stupid teenagers. That day started like any other summer day. Me, my younger brother Michael, and my 2 buddies Jason and Rick decided to go hunting. Nothing serious, just looking for some rabbits or maybe a deer if we got lucky. We'd been doing this since we were old enough to hold rifles. Our parents trusted us. Everybody grew up handling guns in our part of Maine. We headed out around 3 in the afternoon. I remember checking my watch before we left because Mom had been nagging us about being home before dark. The plan was to be back by 7, giving us about 4 hours in the woods. We took our usual trail behind my house, which eventually led deeper into the forest. I had my dad's .30-30 Winchester, Michael had his .22, and Jason and Rick both had their own rifles. We were talking about school starting up again soon and complaining about summer ending too fast. Normal stuff. The forest was thick in that part of Piscataquis. When people say remote, they don't really understand what that means until they've been in Maine's northern woods. There's a kind of isolation that weighs on you. The nearest neighbor to our house was 3 miles away. The closest ranger station was well over 15 miles from where we were hunting. We were completely on our own out there, which never bothered us before. We knew those woods, or at least we thought we did. As the afternoon wore on, we got deeper into the forest than we usually went. I recall looking at the position of the sun through the trees and realizing we'd gone farther than planned. It was getting close to dusk, maybe around 6:30 or so, and we'd only managed to bag a couple of rabbits. Rick had shot one, and I got the other. Not much of a haul, but it was something. We were just about to head back when we heard it. I'll never forget that sound as long as I live. It wasn't a bear growl or a moose call or anything I'd ever heard before. It was like a cross between a deep, rumbling howl and a scream. It seemed to echo through the trees, making it impossible to tell exactly where it was coming from. All 4 of us froze. "What the hell was that?" Michael whispered. His face had gone pale. "Probably just a bear," Jason said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. We stood completely still, listening. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that sudden silence is never a good sign. Then we heard it again, closer this time. It raised the hair on the back of my neck. Whatever made that sound was big, and it was moving toward us. "Let's get out of here," Rick suggested, adjusting his grip on his rifle. I nodded, but something made me turn toward where I thought the sound had come from. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, partially obscured by a cluster of pine trees, was a figure. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear standing on its hind legs, maybe, or just a shadow playing tricks on my eyes. But as I focused, I realized it was something else entirely. It was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand that straight. They don't have shoulders like a man. The thing was just standing there, watching us. I could see its outline clearly against the darkening forest. Broad shoulders, long arms that hung down past its knees, and a head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders without much of a neck. "Do you guys see that?" I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figure. "Holy shit," I heard Jason mutter behind me. That's when the smell hit us. It came on suddenly, like walking into a wall. The most foul, putrid odor I've ever encountered, like rotting meat, wet dog, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water and my stomach turn. I actually gagged and had to cover my mouth and nose with my sleeve. Michael started coughing beside me. "What is that smell?" he choked out. But I knew. Somehow I knew that smell was coming from whatever was watching us from the trees. The stench seemed to fill the air around us, like it was seeping into our clothes, our skin. I raised my rifle instinctively, pointing it toward the figure. Michael, Jason, and Rick did the same. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the sights lined up. Part of me wanted to shoot, to eliminate whatever threat this thing posed. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe some deeper instinct telling me that shooting at this creature would be a terrible mistake. For what felt like an eternity, we stood in a standoff. Us, with our rifles raised, the creature simply watching, unmoving. Then it shifted slightly, and I swear I could see its face. Not clearly, it was too dark and too far away, but enough to see that it wasn't human. The brow was heavy, shadowing what looked like deep-set eyes. I glanced at the others to see if they were seeing what I was seeing. That was my mistake. In the split second I took my eyes off the creature, Jason and Rick had already turned and started running. They were sprinting back down the trail we'd come from, leaving Michael and me alone. "Ethan!" Michael hissed at me, his voice cracking with fear. "Let's go!" When I looked back, the creature had taken a step forward, coming partly out from behind the trees. It was even bigger than I'd first thought. Its massive frame was silhouetted against the dimming forest, and I could now clearly see that it was covered in dark, shaggy fur. That was enough for me. I grabbed Michael's arm, and we both turned and ran after Jason and Rick. I've never run so fast in my life. Branches whipped at my face as we tore through the underbrush, trying to catch up to our friends. The whole time, that awful smell seemed to cling to us, following us through the trees. We caught up to Jason and Rick about a quarter mile down the trail. They'd stopped to catch their breath, both looking as terrified as I felt. "What the hell was that thing?" Rick gasped, his face white as a sheet. "I don't know," I admitted, still trying to process what I'd seen. "But we need to get back to town, now." None of us argued with that. We started moving again, not running, but walking fast, constantly looking over our shoulders. The forest that had always felt like home now seemed alien and threatening. Every shadow could be hiding something. Every sound made us jump. After about 10 minutes of walking, Jason suggested we split up to take different routes home. Looking back, it was a stupid idea, but fear doesn't make you think clearly. Jason lived in the opposite direction from us, and Rick's house was closer to his than ours. "We'll move faster if we go separate ways," Jason insisted. "My dad's waiting for me, and he'll be pissed if I'm late." I didn't like it, but I was also desperate to get home, to be somewhere safe. So we agreed. Jason and Rick would take the eastern trail that led toward their neighborhood, while Michael and I would continue south toward our house. We said quick goodbyes and separated. Michael and I had been walking for maybe 5 minutes when we first heard it. The sound of something large moving through the forest, parallel to our path. It wasn't making any effort to be quiet. We could hear branches snapping and undergrowth being crushed under heavy weight. "It's following us," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, afraid. Story 3. Up to you. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened back in the early 90s. I was making the drive from Seattle to Anchorage along the Alcan Highway, something I'd done a few times before, but never in winter. My buddy had moved up to Alaska the year before and needed help getting his truck and some belongings up there, so I volunteered. I don't know why I thought a January drive through northern BC and the Yukon was a good idea, but I was 35, had plenty of wilderness experience, and figured I knew what I was doing. The first couple days were uneventful, just long stretches of driving, stopping at little roadside motels, and dealing with the occasional snow flurry. Around day 3, I was deep into British Columbia. The GPS wasn't really a thing back then, but I remember I was about 45 minutes from Cougar Hot Springs Provincial Park. I'd been looking forward to stopping there to warm up, maybe even stay the night if they had accommodations. The sun was already getting low. It was around 6 in the evening, and in January up there, that meant it was starting to get dark. I was on a relatively straight section of the highway with these rolling hills. Truckers call them whoop-de-doos because they make your stomach drop a little when you go over them. On my right were mountains, and to my left was a steep drop-off down to what looked like a small stream or creek bed. Most of the hillside had been burned in a forest fire, probably the previous summer, leaving this eerie landscape of black skeletal trees against the snow. As I crested one of these hills, something caught my eye at the roadside ahead. At first it was just a dark shape, maybe 100 yards ahead. I remember thinking it was probably a moose. They're everywhere up there, and they sometimes hang out near roads where the snow isn't as deep. I kept driving, dipping down between hills, and then rising again, catching glimpses of whatever it was. Each time I saw it, I was a bit closer, and each time it seemed wrong somehow. The proportions weren't right for a moose, too tall, too thin, maybe a bear. But bears should have been hibernating, and it seemed to be standing in one place, not moving around. About halfway between me and the figure, I slowed down a bit. The truck I was driving was pretty solid, a Ford F-250 with winter tires, but the roads were slippery, and visibility was starting to get poor as dusk settled in. I didn't want to hit anything, especially not a moose or bear that could total the vehicle. Out there, that could mean freezing to death before help arrived. As I got closer, maybe a quarter-mile away, I started to make out more details, and my heart began to race. Whatever this thing was, it stood on two legs. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, probably 7 feet at least, maybe more. And it was doing something to a tree at the roadside, like it was pulling branches off or stripping bark. I remember thinking I was seeing things. Maybe it was a hunter or park ranger in some kind of weird gear. But no hunter or ranger would be out there alone at dusk, miles from anywhere, with no vehicle in sight. And as I got even closer, I could see it was shaggy, covered in what looked like brownish fur or hair, lighter around the edges. I slowed down even more, partly out of caution, and partly because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. When I was about half a mile away, the thing suddenly stopped what it was doing. It just paused, like it sensed me coming. Then it turned, not just its head, but its whole body, toward the road. I swear my blood turned to ice. I've spent my whole life outdoors, hunting, fishing, camping in places most people would never go. I've encountered bears, moose, wolves, mountain lions, but nothing ever made me feel the way I did at that moment. It was primal fear, the kind that's hardwired into your DNA. The creature, because I can't call it an animal, it was too deliberate in its movements, took 2 huge strides, and crossed the entire width of the road. 2 steps. The Alcan isn't a narrow road, and then it disappeared over the cliff edge on the left side. I hit the brakes and came to a stop right where it had been standing. Looking back, that was probably stupid. If this thing was dangerous, I was putting myself right in its path, but I had to know what I'd seen. I sat in the truck for a few minutes, engine running, heat blasting, trying to process what had just happened. Then, against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight, put on my jacket, and stepped out into the cold. The temperature must have been around -20. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and the silence was absolute. That deep wilderness silence that makes your ears ring. My boots crunched in the snow as I walked over to where the creature had been standing. There was a circle about 15 feet across where the snow was disturbed. Not footprints exactly, just areas where something heavy had compressed the snow. Next to the circle was the tree it had been working on, a young pine with several branches freshly broken off, not cut, broken, and these were thick branches, the kind you'd need a saw for. I shined my flashlight across the road, following the path the creature had taken. Again, no clear footprints, just long, swept areas in the snow where something had moved. The sweeps led right to the edge of the embankment and down. I approached the edge cautiously, my heart pounding. The hillside dropped away steeply, maybe a 30 or 40 degree slope, leading down about 100 feet to the creek bed below. Most of the terrain was visible because of the forest fire. Just charred stumps and blackened trunks sticking out of the snow. Only near the creek itself were there living trees, mostly alders and some small pines. I stood there for a long time, sweeping my flashlight back and forth across the hillside, looking for any sign of the creature. Nothing moved. There was no sound except the faint gurgle of the partially frozen creek. After what felt like forever, but was probably only about 20 minutes, I was getting ready to give up and continue my journey. My feet were getting numb despite my thick winter boots, and standing exposed on the road was starting to feel extremely vulnerable. Then I heard it. From somewhere in the woods along the creek came a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. It started as a low howl, almost like a wolf, but then changed into something else. A high-pitched scream that no wolf could make. It wasn't like a cougar scream either, which I've heard plenty of times. This was bigger, louder, more purposeful somehow. I froze, flashlight pointed down the slope, breath coming in short, panicked bursts that turned instantly to vapor in the frigid air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, about 300 yards downstream, I saw movement. A stand of alders near the creek began to bend and sway. Not all at once, like they would in a gust of wind, but in sequence, like something massive was moving through them, pushing them aside as it went. Whatever it was heading downstream, away from me. I couldn't see it directly, just its effect on the vegetation as it moved. I tracked its progress with my flashlight for maybe 30 seconds before it disappeared around a bend in the creek. The whole time, I never actually saw the creature again, just the trail of disturbed alders marking its path. I practically ran back to my truck, hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys in the snow and had to dig for them with increasingly numb fingers. Once inside, I locked the doors, turned the heat up full blast, and sat there, adrenaline coursing through me, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. In 35 years of wilderness experience, I'd never seen anything like it. You learn to identify animals by their size, movement patterns, and behaviors. This thing matched nothing I knew. It wasn't a bear, wrong season, wrong movement style. Wasn't a moose, completely different shape, and no moose pulls branches off trees like that. It sure as hell wasn't a person. I remained parked there for another hour, unable to bring myself to drive on. Part of me wanted to wait, to see if it would return. Another part of me, the rational part, was screaming to get out of there. Eventually, the rational part won. I drove the rest of the way to the hot springs that night, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the roadside. I kept the radio off, straining to hear if anything was following. When I finally reached the small hotel there, I was so keyed up, I could barely speak to the front desk clerk. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, the creature's height, the way it crossed the road in 2 strides, that unearthly howl scream, the path of flattened alders. The next morning, I seriously considered turning around and going home. But I'd promised my buddy I'd get his stuff to Anchorage, and cell service was non-existent out there, so I couldn't even call to explain. Plus, I felt ridiculous. In daylight, in a warm hotel room, the previous evening's terror seemed overblown. I convinced myself I'd seen a moose or maybe a bear that wasn't fully hibernating, and my tired mind had played tricks on me. So I continued the drive. But I never stopped seeing that shape in my mind. Tall, powerful, purposeful. And I never stopped hearing that howl scream echoing through the burnt forest. I've spent 30 years trying to explain to myself what I saw that evening on the Alcan. I've researched every large animal native to British Columbia. I've read accounts of people seeing unusually large wolves or bears. None of it matches. Only once did I try to tell someone about it. A wildlife biologist I met at a conference in Portland a few years later. His dismissive smile and polite suggestions about low light conditions and misidentification of known species made me realize that this was something I needed to keep to myself. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. And sometimes, when I'm out in the woods alone, even back home in Washington, I find myself scanning the trees a little more carefully than I used to, listening a little more intently to the sounds of the forest. Because now I know there are things out there that science doesn't acknowledge, things that live in the deep wilderness where humans rarely go. I've never driven the Alcan in winter since then, and whenever I see those whoop-de-doos on a lonely stretch of road with forest to one side and a drop-off to the other, I get that same icy feeling in my blood, like something's watching, waiting, something that doesn't want to be seen, but occasionally, when the circumstances are just right, reveals itself to a solitary traveler who's far from home. That day on the Alcan Highway changed something fundamental in how I see the wilderness. It's still beautiful, still pulls me back time and again, but now I know it holds secrets. And sometimes I wonder if that thing I saw knows who I am. if it remembers me the way I remember it. If, somewhere in the vast northern forests, it's watching and waiting for our paths to cross again. Story 4. I grew up in a small town called Renovo in northern Pennsylvania. One of those places where everyone knows everyone, and there's not much to do except hang out at the one pizza place or wander around in the woods. My parents were pretty cool about letting me stay out late, especially on weekends, as long as I was with friends and home before midnight. It was a Friday night in early October of '96, and I'd been at my buddy Jake's house playing Resident Evil on his PlayStation. We'd spent hours trying to get past those damn zombies, and I lost track of time until his mom poked her head in around 11 to remind us it was getting late. Jake offered to have his dad drive me home, but it was only about a 20-minute walk, and the night was clear with a full moon. Plus, I'd walked this route like 100 times before. I remember checking my watch as I left his place. It was 11:30 exactly. I had my Walkman with me but decided not to use it. The air had that perfect fall crispness to it, and the moon was so bright you could almost read by it. The town was dead quiet, except for the occasional dog barking in the distance. My route home took me along Mason Street, then down 8th Street, which eventually curved alongside this overgrown field that had once been farmland before I was born. The field was separated from the road by this old, rusted chain-link fence that was falling apart in some places. The last quarter-mile or so of my walk went past this field, and then through a small wooded section before reaching my neighborhood. I was about halfway home, just approaching the field, when I noticed something weird. The night had gone completely silent. Not gradually quiet, I mean like someone had hit a mute button. No crickets, no distant traffic sounds, nothing. It was so sudden that I actually stopped walking and looked around, trying to figure out what had changed. That's when I got the feeling I was being watched. You know that sensation when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? It was like that, but 10 times stronger. I can't explain why, but I immediately looked toward that field behind the fence. At first, I didn't see anything. The moonlight was casting these weird shadows across the tall grass. Then I spotted them, 2 red glowing points about 30 feet beyond the fence. My first thought was that it was just reflection, maybe from a fox or raccoon. But this wasn't normal animal eyeshine that reflects greenish or yellowish. These were deep red, almost like embers from a fire, and they seemed to glow from within rather than reflect light. I froze completely, unsure if I should run or keep walking. The eyes were perfectly still, just watching me. Then it moved forward a few steps, and my blood went ice cold. The moonlight was bright enough that I could make out its shape as it emerged from the deeper shadows. This thing was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. It had the widest shoulders I've ever seen, built like a refrigerator, but with arms and legs. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its head seemed too large for even that massive body, with a pronounced brow ridge that shadowed those glowing red eyes. The thing that still haunts me the most was the way it moved. Fluid and deliberate, not clumsy at all despite its size. It was covered in dark hair or fur that looked almost black in the moonlight, but thinner around the face. I couldn't make out detailed facial features beyond that heavy brow, but what I could see didn't look like any animal I recognized. It had no neck to speak of, just this huge headset directly on those massive shoulders. We just stood there, staring at each other across the fence for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. It made no threatening moves, no sounds. It just observed me. That's the only word I can think of. I had the distinct impression it was studying me as much as I was studying it. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't turn my back on this thing. So I started walking backward, keeping my eyes on it the whole time. It didn't follow me, but turned its body to keep watching as I moved. I was terrified it might suddenly rush the fence, but it never did. When I reached the next streetlight, about 50 yards down, the strangest thing happened. All the normal night sounds came flooding back at once. Crickets, distant traffic, a dog barking. It was jarring after that unnatural silence. I risked a quick glance toward the streetlight, and when I looked back toward the field, the thing was gone. No movement in the grass, no sign it had ever been there. I practically sprinted the rest of the way home. I burst through the door, sweating and pale, and my mom asked what was wrong. I couldn't bring myself to tell her. What would I even say? I saw a monster? A Bigfoot? She'd think I was making it up or using drugs or something. So I just told her I thought I saw someone following me and got scared. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. I kept my blinds closed tight and jumped at every sound outside my window. I started taking the long route home from everywhere, completely avoiding that stretch of road. My parents noticed something was off, but I brushed it off as school stress. I tried researching at the library what I might have seen. This was '96, so the internet wasn't like it is now. I found some books about cryptids and Sasquatch, but none of the descriptions quite matched what I saw, especially those eyes. Everything I read about Bigfoot mentioned eyes that reflected yellow or green, not that internal red glow. About a month after it happened, I worked up the courage to go back to that spot during daylight. I was hoping to find footprints or hair caught on the fence. Anything to prove to myself I hadn't imagined it. But there was nothing. Just overgrown field grass and the same rusty fence. It took almost a year before I told anyone. I finally opened up to Jake when we were camping out in his backyard. He believed me, or at least he said he did, but I could tell he thought I was exaggerating or had seen a bear. The thing is, I grew up in Pennsylvania. I know what bears look like. This wasn't a bear. What's weird is that over the next few years, I heard whispered stories around town about other people seeing strange things in the woods around Renovo. An old-timer at the gas station once mentioned red eyes to his buddy when I was buying soda, and I nearly dropped my drink. But when I tried to ask him about it, he clammed up completely. There was one night during my senior year when I was driving home from a late basketball practice. It was winter, already dark by 6 o'clock. I took the road that passed that same field, driving slowly because of ice patches. My headlights swept across the field, and just for a split second, I thought I saw something tall duck behind a cluster of trees at the back of the property. I hit the gas and didn't slow down until I reached my driveway. I left for college in '99 and rarely came back to Renovo, except for holidays. When I did return, I made a point of never being out alone after dark. My parents thought I was being antisocial, but I just couldn't shake the fear that whatever I'd seen was still out there, watching. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was just a bear with some kind of eye condition. Maybe it was a person in some weird costume. Though that doesn't explain the silence or those eyes. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just my imagination, some combination of moonlight and shadows playing tricks on me. But then I remember how it moved, so deliberate and aware. No animal I know moves quite like that. And I remember the absolute stillness that fell over everything, like nature itself was holding its breath. That wasn't imagination. I'm 37 now, living 3 states away with my wife and kids. I've never told them about what happened. How could I? Hey kids, Daddy once saw a monster in the woods. My wife would think I need therapy. But sometimes, when we're driving through rural areas at night, I find myself scanning the tree lines nervously. My wife always asks why I tense up, and I just make some excuse about being tired or watching for deer. The truth is, I'm looking for those red eyes. I called my parents last Christmas, and during our conversation, they mentioned that development had finally reached that old field. Some company bought the land and was putting up storage units or something. Part of me felt relief that they were clearing away all that overgrown grass and those shadowy trees. But another part wondered, where would it go now? What if they disturbed something that had been there for who knows how long? I've tried researching similar encounters over the years. The internet has made that easier, but it's also filled with obvious hoaxes and exaggerations. Nothing quite matches what I saw. The closest accounts are from people who've encountered what they call Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but even those stories usually describe creatures with different eye colors or behavior patterns. Whatever I saw that night wasn't acting aggressively. It didn't try to chase me or threaten me in any obvious way, but there was something in the way it watched me that suggested intelligence, not just animal curiosity, but something calculating. That's what still gives me chills when I think about it. I don't know what to call what I saw that night. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some local Pennsylvania cryptid with no name. All I know is that it was real. It was watching me. And for that brief moment, when our eyes met across that field, I felt like I was the one being studied, like I was the curiosity, not it. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else from Renovo has seen it. If that old man at the gas station really knew something about red eyes, or if it was just coincidence. I wonder if it's still there, watching from the edges of the forest as bulldozers tear up its hiding place. I still check the locks 3 times before bed. I still sleep with the blinds completely closed. And if I ever hear that unnatural silence fall again, that absolute stillness that seems to swallow all sound, I know I'll run without looking back. Because some things aren't meant to be seen twice. And whatever was watching me from that field 21 years ago is one of them. Story 5. I've never really told many people about what happened to me back in the winter of '78. For the longest time, I kept it to myself because, well, who's going to believe a 9-year-old kid? And later, I just didn't want to be that guy who claims he saw Bigfoot. But I know what I saw that day, and even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and see it clear as day. It was one of those Pennsylvania winters that people around here still talk about. The snow started falling right after Thanksgiving and just kept coming. My dad called it a sledding winter, the kind where the snow piles up and doesn't melt for weeks because it stays so cold. For us kids, it was paradise. No school for days at a time, and the whole world turned into one giant playground. Our favorite spot was behind St. Mark's Lutheran Church on the edge of town. The church sat on top of this perfect hill that sloped down toward the woods. The ground dropped at just the right angle, steep enough to get some real speed, but not so steep that you'd crash and hurt yourself too bad. The pastor didn't mind us sledding there as long as we stayed away from the stained glass windows. I remember him watching us sometimes from his office, smiling and waving. That particular Saturday in January, my mom had dropped me, and my flexible flyer slid off around 10 in the morning. She was heading to the grocery store and said she'd pick me up around 3. When I got there, a bunch of kids from my class were already racing down the hill, maybe 7 or 8 of us total. There was Bobby Gaines and his sister Sarah, the Mitchell twins, Pete Conroy, Kevin Schmidt, and a couple others. The sun was bright that day, making the snow almost painful to look at without squinting. It must have been around 15 degrees, but we were bundled up good in our snowsuits, mittens, and boots. My mom had wrapped this itchy scarf around my face about 3 times, and I kept having to readjust it because my breath would freeze on it. We spent hours racing down that hill. We'd make trains by linking our sleds together or try to stand up while sledding down, which usually ended with someone face-planting into the snow. At one point, we built this little ramp near the bottom that sent us flying for a few feet before coming down hard. Bobby Gaines actually went so far he ended up at the edge of the trees, and we all cheered like he'd won the Olympics or something. By early afternoon, we were all getting tired. The Mitchell twins had gone home for lunch and didn't come back. Pete's dad had picked him up, and Kevin and Bobby were having a snowball fight off to the side of the hill. I was sitting alone at the top, catching my breath and just kind of taking in the view. From up there, you could see over the tree line to the mountains in the distance. The trees were all heavy with snow, branches bending under the weight. The woods looked different in winter, darker somehow, even in the bright sunlight, with all those shadows stretching across the white ground. That's when I noticed something moving down at the bottom of the hill, where the clearing met the tree line. At first, I thought it might be a deer. We saw them all the time, especially in winter when they'd come closer to town looking for food. Or maybe it was someone's dog that had gotten loose. I leaned forward, my mittens pressing into the snow to steady myself as I tried to get a better look. What stepped out from behind one of the big pine trees wasn't a deer, and it definitely wasn't a dog. I remember freezing in place, not even breathing for what felt like a full minute. About 40 or 50 feet past the edge of where our sleds would stop, standing right there in broad daylight, was something I couldn't make sense of. It was huge, taller than my dad by a lot, and my dad was 6 feet. This thing had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark hair, a brownish-black color like a bear, but it wasn't a bear. It walked on 2 legs completely upright, with a smooth, even stride that seemed almost careful. The hair was thick and shaggy, hanging longer in some places than others, especially around what I guess you'd call its shoulders. Despite the freezing temperature, it wasn't wearing clothes of any kind. The thing that struck me most was how it didn't shine in the sunlight. Everything else that day was bright and reflective. The snow, our colorful winter coats, even the dark tree trunks had a sheen to them in the winter light. But this thing seemed to absorb the light somehow. It was like looking at a shadow that had pulled itself off the ground and taken shape. I sat there, my sled forgotten beside me, as this creature walked parallel to the bottom of our sledding hill. Its arms hung down much lower than a person's would, past its knees, and they swung slightly as it moved. Its head seemed directly connected to its shoulders, with almost no neck that I could see, and then it turned its head toward me. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but I could tell it was looking right at me. Not just in my direction, at me. I felt it. There was an awareness there, an intelligence. I didn't feel threatened exactly, but I knew with absolute certainty that it knew I was watching it. The strangest part was the silence. You know how winter has its own kind of quiet, where the snow seems to muffle everything? This was different. It was like the whole world had pressed pause. I couldn't hear Bobby and Kevin's snowball fight anymore. I couldn't hear the wind or distant cars or anything. Just complete silence as this thing, and I looked at each other. I don't know exactly how long we stayed like that. Probably only seconds, but it felt much longer. Then it simply turned away and continued walking. Its stride was long and deliberate, and within moments it disappeared behind another large tree. I waited for it to emerge on the other side, but it never did. I remember sitting there for what felt like forever, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Part of me wanted to call the other kids over, to have them see what I'd seen. But they were down at the bottom of the hill now, and I was afraid that if I yelled, the thing might come back. Or worse, they wouldn't believe me and would think I was making it up for attention. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of my fear. I grabbed my sled and made my way down the hill, going much slower than I had all day. When I reached the bottom, I tried to act casual around the other kids, who were still throwing snowballs at each other. "I'm gonna check something out," I told Bobby, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Whatever," he said, too busy trying to nail Kevin with a particularly large snowball to really pay attention to me. I walked toward the trees, following what I thought was the creature's path. The snow was deep there, almost to my knees, and I expected to find huge footprints, but the ground under the trees had less snow, and what was there had a crusty layer on top that seemed undisturbed. I went from tree to tree, looking behind each one, half expecting to come face to face with the thing, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign at all that anything had been there just minutes before. I even found the exact pine tree I'd seen it emerge from, and there was nothing behind it but more trees and untouched snow. It didn't make sense. Something that big should have left tracks. It should have broken through that crusty top layer of snow, should have disturbed the branches, should have left some evidence. But there was nothing. I stood there, confused and a little scared, when I heard my mom honking her car horn up in the church parking lot. It was time to go home. I ran back to get my sled, said quick goodbyes to the other kids, and trudged up the hill, looking back over my shoulder at the woods every few steps. That night at dinner, I wanted to tell my parents what I'd seen. But just as I was about to speak up, my dad started talking about how some guy at his work claimed to have seen a UFO and how everybody was laughing about it. "Guy's never gonna live it down," my dad said, shaking his head. "Once people think you're crazy, that's it." So I stayed quiet. I didn't tell anyone, not my parents, not my friends, not my teachers. I kept it locked away, this strange encounter that made no sense, but that I knew with absolute certainty had happened. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep well. I kept seeing that figure whenever I closed my eyes, the way it moved, the way it looked at me. I begged off. Story 6. I still can't shake what happened that summer. No matter how many times I try to rationalize it away. It's been 30 years, but sometimes when I'm running trails, I still catch myself looking over my shoulder or freezing when I hear something rustling in the brush. It was mid-July, 1993. I was 26, in peak physical condition and obsessed with trail running. I lived in Portland at the time and would drive out to different trails around the Columbia River Gorge almost every weekend. The solitude and the challenge of those mountain paths were addictive. There's nothing like that runner's high when you're surrounded by old-growth forest. That Saturday morning was perfect, around 65 degrees with a light breeze, not much humidity. I decided to check out a service road near Tanner Creek by Bonneville Dam. It wasn't a popular spot for hikers or runners, which was exactly what I wanted. I'd discovered it a few weeks earlier while exploring backroads and was drawn to how secluded it felt, despite being relatively close to Interstate 84. I parked my Toyota 4Runner at the small gravel lot where the service road began. It was around 9 in the morning, and mine was the only vehicle there. I remember doing my usual stretches, filling my water bottle and strapping on my fanny pack with some energy bars and a small first aid kit. I didn't bring my Walkman that day. I wanted to hear the sounds of nature. The first 3 miles were incredible. The service road climbed steadily uphill, with the Columbia River occasionally visible through gaps in the trees below. Douglas firs towered overhead, creating this cathedral effect with the sunlight filtering through. The air smelled like pine sap and earth. Birds were singing, and twice I spotted deer watching me from deeper in the woods before bounding away. About 45 minutes in, I reached a point where the service road leveled out and ran along the side of the mountain. On my right was the steep, forested slope going up, and on my left was a sharp drop-off with thick brush and trees below, eventually leading down to Tanner Creek. I'd slowed to a comfortable pace, just enjoying the run and the solitude. That's when I first noticed something was off. It wasn't anything I saw. It was a feeling. That prickly sensation on the back of your neck when you suddenly realize you're being watched. I actually stopped for a moment and looked around, but didn't see anything unusual. Just trees, brush, the empty service road stretching ahead and behind me. I took a swig of water and kept running, telling myself it was just my imagination. About a quarter-mile later, I heard it for the first time. Movement in the brush below the trail. Not just a small animal scurrying around, but something substantial enough to make branches snap. I slowed again, peering down the slope, but the vegetation was too thick to see through. The strange thing was that the sounds seemed to be keeping pace with me, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. Probably just a deer following the path of least resistance, I told myself, though deep down I knew deer don't typically parallel humans that way. I picked up my pace a bit, partly to test my theory and partly because the situation was making me uneasy. The sounds below matched my increased speed perfectly. Whatever was down there was deliberately pacing me through some really challenging terrain. The slope was steep and covered with dense undergrowth, fallen logs and rocks. I stopped abruptly, and the movement below stopped too, but not immediately. There was a slight delay, like it had taken a couple more steps before realizing I'd stopped. That's when I felt the first real surge of fear. Deer don't do that. Neither do other typical forest animals. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding thin in the quiet forest. What happened next still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. A few seconds after I called out, from the thick brush below came a response, not an echo, but a mimicking of my call in a deep, guttural voice. "Who's there?" It wasn't exactly like my voice. It was deeper, rougher, like someone trying to imitate human speech without quite getting it right. But the inflection, the rhythm, it was clearly mimicking me. I stood frozen on that service road, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I tried to convince myself it was just another hiker playing a prank, but deep down I knew better. The terrain below was virtually impassable without serious bushwhacking, and the voice didn't sound fully human. "Hello, hello, hello," I shouted, partly as a challenge and partly hoping that if it was a person, they'd respond normally. After a brief pause, "Hi-yo, hi-yo, hi-yo," came the response, in that same guttural approximation of human speech. I started running again, faster now, no longer enjoying the experience but looking to put distance between myself and whatever was down there. The sounds below kept pace perfectly, which should have been impossible given the terrain. I was on a clear service road, while whatever was tracking me was navigating a steep, densely vegetated slope without slowing down at all. I remember thinking, this isn't happening, even as adrenaline surged through my body. I've spent countless hours in the outdoors, hiking, camping, running, and I'd never experienced anything like this. Logic told me there had to be a rational explanation, but every instinct was screaming danger. After about half a mile of this terrifying game, I decided to try something else. I stopped and turned to face downslope, scanning the brush for any sign of movement. "What do you want?" I called out, my voice shakier than I'd have liked. Silence. Complete silence. Even the birds had gone quiet. Then, from much closer than before, maybe just 30 feet down the slope, "What do you want?" The mimicry was more precise now, clearly copying not just my words, but my nervous tone. That was it. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Pure, fear-driven speed. No pacing, no conserving energy, just flat-out running for my life. The thing below kept pace effortlessly, crashing through underbrush, occasionally letting out these strange vocalizations that weren't quite words but seemed deliberately meant to let me know it was still there. At one point, I heard a sound that I can only describe as wood striking wood. Sharp, deliberate knocks that seemed to be coming from multiple directions. It was as if whatever was following me was communicating with others. The service road curved ahead, and as I rounded the bend, I heard heavy movement directly below me, coming up slope fast. I glanced down and caught just a glimpse of something large and dark moving through the trees. Not a clear sighting, just an impression of massive size and dark brown or black coloration. In that split second, I thought I saw a massive shoulder covered in hair, but it was so quick and I was so terrified that I can't be 100% certain. I don't know how I made it back to my car. The 3 miles that had been such a pleasant run earlier now passed in a blur of terror. My lungs were burning, my legs were like rubber, but fear kept me moving at a pace I didn't think was possible for me. The whole time that thing stayed with me, sometimes directly parallel, sometimes moving ahead as if to cut me off, but always there. When the gravel lot finally came into view, I nearly cried with relief. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. As I jumped into my 4Runner and slammed the door, I looked back at the forest edge. Nothing visible, but I could feel eyes watching me. I started the engine and peeled out of that lot, spitting gravel. In my rearview mirror, I thought I saw movement at the tree line, but I was going too fast to be sure. It took me 20 minutes of driving before my heart rate started to normalize. I pulled over at a gas station near Cascade Locks to collect myself. My t-shirt was soaked with sweat, and my hands were still trembling. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. I told a couple of friends who predictably suggested it was either a bear, impossible given how it mimicked speech, or some weirdo in the woods, equally impossible given how it navigated terrain that would challenge even the most experienced hiker. I started researching unusual encounters in that area and came across mentions of Bigfoot sightings, which I had always dismissed as folklore. About 2 weeks later, I drove back to the area, not to run, but just to see if the service road was still accessible. To my surprise, there was a Forest Service barrier across the entrance with a sign stating the area was temporarily closed due to environmental assessment. When I asked a ranger at the nearby station about it, he was vague, mentioning something about wildlife concerns, but providing no specifics. His evasiveness only added to my unease. Later, I learned more about the area's history. The Bonneville Dam had been built over an ancient Indian burial ground, with remains hastily relocated in the 1930s. The spot where my encounter occurred was near an area the local tribes had traditionally avoided, calling it the place of bad spirits, according to a book on regional history I found. I also discovered that Skamania County, just across the river in Washington, has a Bigfoot protection ordinance on the books and hosts an annual Bigfoot festival. The locals there don't treat these stories as jokes. Many firmly believe something lives in those forests. The stretch of land where I had my encounter contains some weird geographical features too. There are lava beds where compasses supposedly go haywire, and areas where the ground feels hollow underfoot. Some of the basalt cliffs have cave systems that haven't been fully explored. It's the kind of landscape where things could hide undiscovered. In the years since, I've gone back to running trails, but never alone in remote areas, and never in that specific spot. I've tried to convince myself that there must be a logical explanation, but nothing fits all aspects of what happened. Whatever followed me that day showed intelligence, purpose, and an ability to mimic human speech in a way that no known animal can do. I've read accounts from others who've had similar experiences in the Pacific Northwest. Many describe the same wood-knocking sounds I heard and the same eerie mimicry. Some have had clearer sightings than mine. After my experience, I'm much less quick to dismiss these stories. The Forest Service eventually reopened the road years later, but getting to that specific area now requires a much longer hike. Sometimes I wonder if they closed it because of other reports similar to mine. I've thought about going back with a group, but something always holds me back. There are some encounters that fundamentally change how you see the world, and mine was one of them. To this day, I can't explain what tracked me through the forest that summer morning in 1993. I only know that it was intelligent enough to mimic human speech, powerful enough to move effortlessly through impossible terrain, and deliberate enough in its actions to make me feel like prey. When I'm in the woods now and hear something rustling in the brush, I don't automatically assume it's just a deer anymore. Some things you can't unknow, no matter how much you might want to. Story 7. I've never told this story to many people. When I have, I usually get those looks. You know the ones. But I know what I saw back in the spring of 1993. I was 13 years old, and some memories just stick with you no matter how much time passes. That day at Applegate Lake changed how I look at the woods forever. My family had been planning this hiking trip for weeks. My dad, mom, little brother Ryan, who was 9 at the time, my grandma Eileen, who was visiting from Montana, and our golden retriever, Hey Girl. We lived about 40 minutes from Medford, Oregon, and Applegate Lake was this beautiful spot nearby that we'd visit a few times each year. That morning started like any other family outing, my parents arguing over directions while packing the truck, Ryan complaining about having to go hiking instead of playing Nintendo, and Grandma quietly making sandwiches in the kitchen. Hey Girl was the most excited of all of us, running circles around the yard, knowing she was going somewhere fun. It was a cool spring morning, probably early April. I remember wearing my favorite flannel shirt and a light jacket. The trees were just starting to show their leaves, and everything smelled fresh after the winter. We loaded up our old blue Ford pickup, Dad's pride and joy, and headed out around 9 in the morning. The drive to Applegate was always pretty, winding through the hills with forests on both sides. Dad kept pointing out different birds to Ryan through the window, trying to get him to care about nature. Mom was talking to Grandma about some TV show they both watched. Hey Girl sat between me and Ryan in the back seat, her head hanging out the window, tongue flapping in the wind. We reached the parking area for the Collins Mountain Trail just before 10:30. What struck me immediately was how empty it was. Usually, there'd be at least a few cars there on a nice spring weekend, but we were the only ones. Dad mentioned something about getting lucky with parking, but it felt strange. The silence was heavy. No birds chirping, no wind in the trees. Just quiet. This place is dead today, Dad said as he pulled out our backpacks from the truck bed. Mom was helping Ryan with his shoes, and Grandma was putting on this old-fashioned hiking hat she always wore. Hey Girl was sniffing around the parking lot, wagging her tail. The Collins Mountain Trail was one we'd hiked before. It loops around parts of the lake, eventually leading to Cooking Green's campground and Seattle Bar Lake if you go the whole way. We were just planning to hike for a couple hours and have lunch somewhere with a view of the water. Dad led the way, followed by Mom, then Ryan, me, Grandma and Hey Girl bringing up the rear. The trail started normal enough. Dirt path through pine trees, some rocks here and there, occasional glimpses of the lake through the trees, but something felt off. I couldn't place it at first, but the woods seemed too quiet. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that forests are never actually silent. There's always something. Birds, squirrels, insects, wind. But that day, nothing. We'd gone maybe a quarter mile in when everything changed. Hey Girl, who had been happily trotting behind us, suddenly let out this awful whining noise. I turned around and saw her hackles raised, her ears flat against her head. Before any of us could react, she bolted, not forward along the trail, but backward, straight toward the parking lot. Hey Girl, I shouted, starting to run after her. Dad called out for me to wait, but I was already heading back. She was our dog, and I needed to know what was wrong. I ran maybe 100 feet back when I lost sight of her around a bend. That's when I noticed something just off the trail to my right. At first glance, it looked like someone had been digging small holes, but as I got closer, I realized they were footprints, human-like footprints, except they weren't human at all. I froze, staring at them. They were huge, I mean absolutely massive. Later, when I measured my own foot against where they had been, I figured they had to be well over 16 inches long, and deep too, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The front part sank about 1.5 inches into the ground, but the heel was pushed nearly 3 inches down. And this wasn't in mud or soft dirt, this was regular forest floor, packed down from years of hikers. The stride between them was what really got me. I'm tall for my age, but I couldn't come close to matching the distance between prints when I tried to step from one to the next. They were easily 1.5 times what a normal human could manage. I was still staring at them when the rest of my family caught up. "Trevor, what are you doing? Where's Hey Girl?" Mom asked, sounding annoyed and worried at the same time. I couldn't even look at her. I just pointed at the ground. "Look." Dad came over first, then froze, just like I had. What the? There were about 8 prints that I could clearly see, leading away from the trail toward a marshy creek area downhill. They weren't in a straight line either. They curved naturally, like whatever made them was walking with purpose. "Robert, what is that?" Mom asked, pulling Ryan closer to her side. Dad knelt down, carefully not touching the prints. "I don't know. Bear, maybe." But we all knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't leave prints like that. These were foot-shaped. Too long, too narrow for a bear. 5 toes at the front, a deep heel impression. Almost human, but wrong. Grandma had been quiet this whole time, but when she finally spoke, her voice was eerily calm. "We should go." I looked up at her, surprised by her tone. She wasn't asking a question or making a suggestion. It was a statement. "You've seen these before?" I asked her. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the prints. "Once, a long time ago, up in Montana. We need to leave, Robert." She addressed my dad by his first name, something she rarely did. Dad started to argue, saying we'd just arrived and had planned this whole day. But then we all heard it. Loud cracking sounds from the direction the footprints led. Branches snapping, brush being pushed aside. Something big was moving down there not too far away. Ryan started crying quietly, pressing himself against Mom. Dad stood up, looking torn between curiosity and protection. "Maybe it's just a deer," Mom offered weakly. And then the sound came. I'll never forget it as long as I live. It wasn't a growl or a roar or anything I could compare to normal wildlife. It was like a cross between a bird call and a monkey. High-pitched at first, then dropping lower, then rising again. Quick, loud, and completely unnatural for the Oregon woods. We all froze. Every hair on my body stood up. It came from up the trail, not from where the prints led, but from ahead of us, where we had been heading. "It's calling to something," Grandma whispered. And then, from the direction of the footprints, came an answer. The same bizarre call, but deeper, louder. They were communicating. Dad grabbed Ryan, Mom grabbed me, and we ran. Not walking, not jogging, flat out sprinting back toward the parking lot. Grandma kept up surprisingly well for her age. The whole time, I kept expecting to feel something grab me from behind. We burst into the clearing where our truck was parked to find Hey Girl cowering underneath it, shaking. Dad practically threw Ryan into the back seat while Mom fumbled with the keys. Grandma and I piled in, and Dad reached under the truck to drag Hey Girl out. She was whimpering and resisting, but he managed to get her into the truck with us. As Dad started the engine, I looked back toward the trailhead. I don't know what I expected to see, but there was nothing. Just trees and the empty trail. Yet the feeling of... Story 8. I've been hesitating to share this for years, but I need to get it off my chest. What happened that night at Cougar Hot Springs has haunted me ever since, and I still can't explain it. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember the look in those eyes, and I know what I saw was real. This happened about 7 years ago. My boys were teenagers then. Corey was 16 and Jake was 14. It was 4th of July weekend, and we decided to take a camping trip. My boyfriend Mark came along, and my sons invited 5 of their friends. We were all excited about spending time in nature, swimming in the hot springs, and just getting away from everything for a while. We left Springfield late in the afternoon. Too late, as it turned out. By the time we reached Cougar Hot Springs, all the official camping spots were taken. I wasn't surprised. It was a holiday weekend after all, but I was disappointed. We drove around for nearly an hour looking for somewhere to set up camp. It was getting dark, and the kids were getting restless in the back of the van. Eventually, we turned down this old logging road that branched off from the main road. About half a mile in, we found a flat clearing that looked perfect. It wasn't an official site, but it was level ground, and there was enough space for our tents. Mark assured me it would be fine for one night. I've never been completely comfortable camping. I'm a light sleeper at the best of times, and being out in the wilderness makes me jumpy. Every little sound wakes me up. The boys always tease me about it, saying I'm a city girl at heart. Maybe they're right. We set up the tents as the sun was setting. The boys and their friends were full of energy, running around, helping with the setup, gathering firewood. Mark got a campfire going, and we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. The kids told ghost stories, trying to scare each other. I remember thinking how beautiful it was out there, under the stars, away from the city lights and noise. By around 11, everyone was ready to turn in. The boys and their friends piled into 2 large tents. Mark fell asleep almost immediately in our tent. He can sleep anywhere, anytime. I lay there listening to the night sounds, watching the stars through the mesh panel at the top of our tent. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint red glow over our campsite. I must have dozed off eventually, but I don't remember falling asleep. What I do remember is waking up. Something had disturbed me, a sound outside, different from the usual forest noises. It was a kind of rustling, like something large moving through the underbrush. My first thought was bears. We'd been careful with our food, storing everything in the van, but still, the possibility of bears always worried me. I sat up slowly, trying not to wake Mark. He was sound asleep, snoring softly. I reached for my glasses and put them on, then carefully unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. That's when I saw them. There were 2 of them, standing in the open area between our tents and the van. 2 creatures I couldn't explain. They weren't bears. They weren't anything I had ever seen before, but I knew immediately what they were. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call them. They were real, and they were standing about 15 feet away from me. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it would explode out of my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared, unable to process what I was seeing. The taller one was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Maybe even taller. It had a strange coloration, sort of a dirty white or grayish color. The smaller one was shorter, maybe 5.5 feet tall, with a reddish-brown color to its hair. It looked younger somehow, like a teenager compared to an adult. They were both just standing there, watching, looking directly at our campsite, at our tents, at me. I realized with a shock that they knew I was awake and looking at them. The taller one's eyes, I swear to God, they were golden, almost amber in color, reflecting the faint moonlight. The smaller one had hazel green eyes. These weren't animals. There was intelligence in those eyes. Their bodies were covered in long, thick hair, except for the palms of their hands and the insides of their fingers. I could see this clearly because the taller one used its hand to gesture at one point. Their build wasn't like a gorilla or an ape. It was more athletic, more human-like, but with broader shoulders and massive chests. Their heads were large but proportional, and their faces, they didn't look like apes. They looked almost human, but not quite. There was a smell too, not horrible or overpowering, but noticeable. It reminded me of fresh dirt, like when you're gardening and dig into rich soil. Earthy. I don't know how long I sat there frozen, just watching them. It could have been minutes or an hour. Time seemed to stop. The smaller one started to move away at one point, stepping back toward the trees. That's when the taller one made a sound, a kind of low groan, and gestured with its left arm for the smaller one to come back, and it did. It obeyed, like a child listening to a parent. The larger creature never took its eyes off me. It swayed slightly from side to side, a gentle rocking motion that seemed almost contemplative. Its expression was hard to read, wary but curious, not aggressive, not threatening, just watching. I was terrified, but also fascinated. I didn't feel like they were going to hurt us. If they wanted to, they could have. We were completely vulnerable, but they just stood there, observing. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The tension was too much. I slowly lay back down in my sleeping bag, still wearing my glasses. I closed my eyes, pretending to sleep. My heart was racing so fast, I thought they might hear it. I lay there for what felt like hours, not daring to look outside again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep for real. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was already high in the sky. Mark was outside the tent making coffee over a small fire. The boys and their friends were up too, packing their things, laughing and talking about what they wanted to do that day. Everything seemed so normal, so ordinary, that for a moment I wondered if I had dreamed the whole thing. "You slept late," Mark said when I crawled out of the tent. "That's not like you, especially out here in the wild." I didn't know what to say. How do you tell someone you saw two Bigfoot creatures standing in your campsite in the middle of the night? They'd think you were crazy. I hesitated, then said, "I had trouble sleeping. Thought I heard something outside during the night." Mark laughed. "Probably just raccoons or something. You and your wilderness paranoia." I was about to let it go when Corey came over looking worried. "Mom, did you mess with the van last night?" "No, why?" "There's something weird on the back window." We walked over to the van together. What I saw made my blood run cold. On the dusty rear window there was a clear circle about the size of a large hand, wiped clean as if someone had wanted to look inside. Just one perfect circle in the dirt. "Maybe it was the wind or rain," Mark suggested. "It didn't rain last night," I said quietly. "And look at the shape. It's a perfect circle." Corey shifted uncomfortably. I thought I saw something last night. When I got up to pee." Everyone turned to look at him. "What did you see?" I asked, my heart racing again. He shrugged, trying to play it cool in front of his friends. "Probably nothing. Just thought I saw a face looking in the van window. A hairy face. I figured it was a bear or something." One of his friends laughed nervously. "Dude, that's creepy." I took a deep breath. "I saw something too. Two somethings, actually." I told them everything. About waking up, about the two creatures standing in our campsite, about their appearance, their behavior, everything. As I talked, the boys' expressions changed from skepticism to uneasiness. "You're saying you saw Bigfoot?" Jake asked, half smiling like he thought I might be joking. "Two of them," I said firmly. "A large one and a smaller one." Mark was trying not to smile. "Sarah, honey, you were probably half asleep. You know how your imagination works when you're camping." I was getting frustrated. I had my glasses on. I saw them clearly. Corey was the only one who seemed to take me seriously. "Where exactly were they standing?" I pointed to the spot. We all walked over and examined the ground. The earth was hard and covered with pine needles and leaves, not ideal for footprints. But there were areas where the ground had been disturbed, where the pine needles had been pushed aside, revealing the dirt beneath. "Something was here," Corey said quietly. We searched the surrounding area, but found nothing conclusive. No clear footprints, no hair samples, nothing that would prove what I had seen. But I knew what I had seen, and apparently so had Corey, even if just for a moment. As we packed up to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had experienced something extraordinary. I remember my Story 9, Asudikatium. I don't usually share this story with many people. Most either think I'm making it up or that I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. It's been 23 years, and the memory is still crystal clear, like it happened yesterday, instead of when I was 10 years old. This happened during a family camping trip in the Smoky Mountains in eastern Oregon back in 2000. My parents had been taking us camping every summer since I was old enough to walk, and that year my cousin Jake came along too. He was 11, a year older than me, and my brother Tommy was 12. We were all pretty close growing up. Our campsite was nice. Nothing fancy, just a clearing with enough space for 2 tents, a fire pit, and our parents' old station wagon packed with all our gear. It was late June, Perfect weather for camping. Warm days, cool nights, and thankfully not too many bugs yet. On our second day there, after lunch, us 3 boys were getting restless. My dad suggested we could go explore a bit, but to stay within shouting distance of camp. There was a small stream about 200 yards from our site that he said probably had frogs and salamanders. That was all the encouragement we needed. Tommy grabbed an empty plastic container that had held our sandwiches, and we headed toward the stream. The walk there wasn't difficult, just pushing through some underbrush and stepping over fallen branches. When we got to the stream, it was perfect kid territory. Shallow enough to wade in without any real danger, but deep enough in spots to hold small trout and, as my dad had predicted, plenty of frogs. We spent about an hour splashing around, trying to catch whatever moved. Tommy was always the best at catching things. He had this way of staying perfectly still until the right moment, then snatching frogs right out of the water. I was more of a run and dive kind of kid, which meant I mostly just got wet and scared everything away. Jake was somewhere in between. After a while, Tommy suggested we follow the stream up to see where it came from. It was flowing downhill, obviously, and he figured there might be a spring or something at the source. That sounded like an adventure, so we agreed. We followed it upstream for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, occasionally stopping to investigate interesting rocks or try for another frog. The stream led us to exactly what Tommy had predicted, a small spring feeding into a crystal-clear pool about the size of our living room back home. Around the pool was a ring of soft, grassy earth that made a perfect place to sit. It was like something out of a nature documentary. This perfect little hidden spot, surrounded by pine trees and bushes, with sunlight filtering through the branches overhead. We'd been there maybe 10 minutes when Tommy suddenly announced he needed to use the bathroom. Not just pee, which he would have just done in the woods, but the other kind. He said he'd go back to camp to use the outhouse and would be back in a bit. Jake and I decided to stay by the spring and keep catching frogs. After Tommy left, Jake and I took off our shoes and socks and dangled our feet in the cold water. We'd caught 4 frogs by then and had them in the container, watching them hop around. I remember feeling so perfectly content in that moment. Just 2 kids in nature, no worries. The sun warm on my back, the water cool on my feet. About 20 minutes after Tommy left, though honestly it's hard to know exactly how long it was since we didn't have watches, something changed. That's the only way I can describe it. The atmosphere just shifted. The first thing I noticed was the silence. 1 minute there were birds calling, frogs croaking, the normal background noise of the forest. Then suddenly, nothing. Absolute silence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just quiet. It was unnaturally quiet, like someone had hit a mute button on the world. Jake must have felt it too, because he stopped talking mid-sentence about some video game. We both just froze, feet still in the water, suddenly alert. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. "I don't hear anything," Jake whispered back. "That's what's weird." We sat completely still. Then we heard it, rustling in the bushes, maybe 30 feet behind us. My first thought was it might be a deer. We'd seen a few along the road on our drive into the mountains. The rustling continued for a few seconds, then stopped. Then came the snap of a twig breaking, loud in the silence. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see a deer or maybe even a bear. We'd been warned they were in the area. What I saw instead is something I'll never forget as long as I live. Peering at me from above the bushes was a face. Not a human face, but not quite an animal face either. It was dark and leathery, surrounded by what looked like dark hair or fur. For a second, our eyes locked, mine and this thing's. It had black eyes, not evil-looking, just dark and intelligent. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then it shifted slightly sideways, and I could see more of it. Its upper torso and head were now visible above the bushes. That's when I realized how tall it must be. The bush it was standing behind was easily 6 feet high, and this thing was looking down at it. I'd guess it was at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its head seemed small for its body, and it barely had a neck. Its head just kind of sat on these massive shoulders, and except for that leathery face, it was covered in dark brown or black hair, not fur exactly, but longer hair than a bear would have. Here's the strangest part. It didn't seem aggressive. If anything, it looked surprised to see us, like we had interrupted its day as much as it had interrupted ours. It tilted its head slightly, almost like it was curious. I remember thinking it looked more confused than threatening. My body acted before my brain could fully process what I was seeing. I grabbed Jake's arm. He was still facing the pond and hadn't turned around yet, and I just said, "Run, now." Something in my voice must have conveyed the urgency because he didn't question me or turn to look. We both just scrambled to our feet and took off, leaving our shoes and socks and the container of frogs behind. I didn't look back, not once. We ran along the stream heading back toward camp. I remember the stones cutting into my bare feet, but I didn't care. The adrenaline was pumping so hard I barely felt it. Jake kept asking what I'd seen, but I couldn't talk. Couldn't waste energy on anything but running. We ran into Tommy about halfway back to camp. He took one look at our faces and started running with us without even asking why. That's how scared we must have looked. The weirdest thing is that none of us fell. That trail was uneven and slippery with moss in places, but it was like some survival instinct kicked in and made us sure-footed. When we got back to camp, we were all gasping for breath. My parents and Jake's mom were sitting around the fire, and they jumped up when they saw us burst into the clearing, wild-eyed and barefoot. "What happened? Where are your shoes?" My mom was instantly in mother bear mode, checking us for injuries. "Kevin saw something in the woods," Jake said, and everyone turned to look at me. I tried to explain, but the words sounded crazy even as I said them. There was a thing by the spring. It was watching us. It was huge and hairy, but with a face like, I don't know, leather. My dad immediately grabbed his rifle from the car. He'd brought it for protection against bears, and asked me to show him where this happened. But there was no way I was going back there. No way. I started crying, which was embarrassing in front of Jake, but I couldn't help it. The shock was wearing off, and reality was setting in. My dad and Jake's mom went to retrieve our shoes instead, carrying the rifle just in case. They came back 20 minutes later with our stuff, saying they hadn't seen anything unusual. My dad tried to tell me it was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs, which they sometimes do. But I know what bears look like. This wasn't a bear. That night in the tent, Tommy asked me to describe exactly what I'd seen. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You know what that sounds like, right?" he finally said. I nodded in the darkness. "Bigfoot." "Yeah." We didn't say anything else about it that night. The next morning, my parents wanted to continue with the camping trip as planned. We were supposed to stay 2 more days. But none of us kids would go anywhere near that stream again, and we jumped at every sound in the forest. After a tense breakfast, where Jake and I kept looking over our shoulders and Tommy kept his pocket knife clutched in his hand, my parents finally agreed to pack up and head home early. On the drive back, my dad tried again to convince me I'd seen a bear. My mom suggested it might have been a person, maybe a hunter wearing camouflage. I stopped trying to argue with them. I knew what I saw. When we got home, I went to the library and checked out books about Bigfoot sightings. Everything I read made me more convinced. The descriptions matched: the height, the hair, the face, the behavior of just watching, not attacking. And eastern Oregon, particularly the more remote mountain areas, had a history of sightings. As the years passed, I shared the story less and less. The skepticism and eye-rolling just wasn't worth it. But I know what I saw that day. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a hunter. It was something that shouldn't exist according to science, but it does. It's out there in the forests of Oregon. I'm 33 now. I've gone camping many times since then, even back to the Strawberry Mountains once in college with friends, though I made sure we stayed far away from that particular area. I've never seen anything like that creature again, and part of me is relieved, but another part of me wishes I had my phone with a camera back then, so I could have proof. Sometimes I wonder if it ever thinks about the two small humans it encountered that day, if it told its family about the strange, hairless creatures it saw sitting by its drinking spot, if it was as scared of us as we were of it. I've read that the indigenous peoples of that region have stories about wild men of the forests that go back centuries. They didn't treat them as myths, but as another type of people who shared their lands. I understand that perspective now. Whatever I saw didn't feel like a monster from a horror movie. It felt like an encounter with something rare and wild and intelligent, something that has managed to stay hidden from most human eyes, but is nevertheless real. I sometimes wonder how many other people have had similar encounters, but never speak of them for fear of ridicule. How many sightings go unreported because people don't want to be labeled crazy? I don't blame them for staying quiet. Most days I do too. But what I saw was real. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night and the house is quiet, I can still see those dark, intelligent eyes looking into mine across a gap that seemed to span not just distance, but entire worlds of understanding. In that brief moment, two species that weren't supposed to meet looked at each other in mutual surprise. And then, just as quickly, the moment was gone. I fled. It presumably disappeared back into the forest, and life went on. But I carry the certainty with me every day. These creatures exist. They're out there. And occasionally, if you're in the right place at exactly the right moment, your path might cross with one of theirs. And in that instant, everything you thought you knew about the world changes forever. Story 10. I'm writing this down because I need to get it off my chest, even though it's been 3 months since it happened. I've always been a skeptical person, the type who needs solid evidence before believing in anything unusual. But what happened near Timberline Village last hunting season has shaken that foundation. My buddy Bill and I had plans to meet our friends Lloyd and Davis for our annual deer hunting trip. We always try to get somewhere remote, away from the weekend warriors who flood the more accessible areas. This particular year, Bill had found this perfect little cabin about 15 miles from the nearest proper road, deep in the wilderness outside Timberline. The cabin was basically just 4 walls and a roof with a small wood stove, but it was shelter. We decided to head up 2 days early to get everything set up before the others arrived. The drive-in was rough. We had to take Bill's truck as far as we could on this old logging road, then hike the last 3 miles with our gear. It took us 2 trips to get everything to the cabin. By the time we finished, it was late afternoon, and we were beat. The cabin itself was smaller than we expected, maybe 20 by 15 feet, with 2 small windows and a door that didn't quite close right. You could tell nobody had used it in years. There were cobwebs everywhere, and the floor was covered in dust and dead leaves that had blown in. We spent what was left of the daylight sweeping out the cabin, patching a hole in the roof with some plastic sheeting we'd brought and gathering firewood. Bill got the stove going while I organized our supplies. The whole time I had this weird feeling of being watched. I kept looking out the windows, but there was nothing there except trees and the approaching darkness. While gathering firewood, I wandered about 50 yards from the cabin and stumbled onto what looked like an old settlement. Just some stone foundations mostly, nothing standing except a crumbling chimney. Next to it was a small cemetery with maybe 10 or 12 grave markers. Most were simple stones, weathered to the point where you couldn't read them anymore. A couple had what looked like native carvings on them. I didn't think much of it at the time. These old hunting territories are full of abandoned settlements from the logging days. We heated up some canned stew for dinner, had a few beers, and turned in early. The cabin had 2 old metal frame beds with nasty-looking mattresses, so we'd brought our sleeping bags to use on top of them. I remember lying there, listening to Bill's snoring and thinking how quiet it was otherwise. No cars, no planes, just the occasional hoot of an owl and the wind in the trees. I fell asleep pretty quickly, exhausted from the hike and setup, but I woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat. The stove had made the cabin way too hot. I checked my watch. It was 2:15 in the morning. I unzipped my sleeping bag to cool off and was about to try getting back to sleep when I heard it. It was a sharp, distinct sound from outside, like wood striking wood, a solid crack that cut through the night. My first thought was that maybe a dead branch had fallen, but then it happened again about 30 seconds later, then again, and again. The timing wasn't regular, but it didn't sound random either. It was like someone was out there deliberately making these knocking sounds. I sat up and grabbed my flashlight, listening. The knocks continued, sometimes with just seconds between them, sometimes with a minute or more of silence. They seemed to be coming from different directions around the cabin, like whatever was making the sound was moving. I tried to wake Bill, but he's the heaviest sleeper I've ever known. He just grunted and rolled over. I didn't want to turn the flashlight on and blind myself, so I sat there in the dark, listening to these knocks that now had a distinct pattern to them. 3 quick knocks, pause, then 2 more, over and over, moving around the cabin. Eventually, I got up, pulled on my boots, and grabbed my rifle. I wasn't about to go outside, but I wanted to be prepared if whatever it was decided to come in. I sat on the edge of my bed, rifle across my knees, and waited. The knocking continued for what felt like forever. According to my watch, it finally stopped around 3 in the morning. I sat there for another hour just to be sure, before finally lying back down. It took me a long time to fall asleep. When morning came, Bill was already up and had coffee going on the stove. I must have finally fallen into a deep sleep, because I didn't hear him get up. I told him about the knocking and he looked at me like I was crazy. "Probably just a tree branch hitting the roof," he said, handing me a cup of coffee. "No," I insisted. "It was moving around the cabin, and it had a pattern to it." Bill didn't seem convinced, but he agreed to look around outside with me after breakfast. We ate quickly, just instant oatmeal and more coffee, then grabbed our rifles and headed out. It was a clear, cold morning. The forest around the cabin was mostly pine and birch, with thick undergrowth that made it hard to see very far. We circled the cabin, looking for anything unusual, but didn't find anything obvious. No footprints, no broken branches that could explain the knocking. I showed Bill the old settlement ruins and the cemetery I'd found the day before. In the daylight, the cemetery looked even smaller and more forgotten. As we were standing there, Bill pointed to something I hadn't noticed before. There were paths winding through the underbrush, not like game trails or human-made paths, but more like something large had pushed through repeatedly, wearing down a route. We followed one of these paths, and about 20 yards in, we found what looked like a bedding area, a large, flattened patch of grass and ferns where something big had laid down. My first thought was maybe a bear, but there were no claw marks on any of the trees nearby, no droppings, nothing to indicate a bear had been there. We found more of these bedding areas as we explored, all clustered around the cabin and the cemetery. Some looked fresh, and others seemed older. The strange thing was, they were huge, much bigger than what a deer would make, and not quite right for a bear either. Maybe elk, Bill suggested, but we both knew there hadn't been elk in this region for decades. We spent another hour searching the area for signs of other people, tire tracks, boot prints, trash, anything that would suggest someone had been playing a prank on us, but found nothing. The logging road we'd come in on hadn't been used in what looked like months before we arrived. We went back to the cabin and spent the rest of the day setting up our hunting camp properly, organizing gear, scouting potential hunting spots for when Lloyd and Davis arrived, and generally trying to keep busy. Neither of us mentioned the knocking sounds or the strange paths again, but I could tell Bill was thinking about it too. He kept looking over his shoulder and suggested we stay closer to the cabin than we'd originally planned. That night, We built up the fire in the stove again, but were careful not to make it too hot. We played cards for a while, drinking whiskey from a flask Bill had brought, and turned in around 10. I was exhausted but afraid I wouldn't be able to sleep. I kept my rifle closer this time, right beside my bed. I must have fallen asleep eventually because the next thing I knew, it was morning. No knocking, no disturbances. Bill was already up again, and when I asked if he'd heard anything in the night, he just shook his head. Lloyd and Davis showed up later that afternoon, right on schedule. They'd brought more supplies, including a cooler of fresh food, which was a welcome change from the canned stuff we'd been eating. We helped them set up their tent outside the cabin. It was too small for all four of us to sleep inside comfortably, and spent the evening catching up. I thought about telling them about the knocking, but something held me back. Bill didn't mention it either. It felt personal somehow, like something I wasn't ready to share yet. The rest of the hunting trip went normally. We got 2 decent-sized bucks, had some good meals around the campfire, and enjoyed being away from civilization for a while. There were no more strange knocking sounds, no feelings of being watched. By the time we packed up to leave 5 days later, I had almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, or that there was some simple explanation I was overlooking. It wasn't until a few weeks after we got back that I mentioned it to my Uncle Mike, who spent his whole life working with remote northern communities. I told him about the knocking sounds and the old settlement with the native cemetery. He got this strange look on his face and just nodded, like he wasn't surprised. When I pressed him for an explanation, he changed the subject. That bothered me more than anything else. The fact that he seemed to recognize what I was describing but didn't want to talk about it. I've done some research since then, read some stories online about similar experiences in remote areas, especially near old Native American territories. Some people call whatever makes those knocking sounds Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but I don't know what to believe. I just know what I heard that night and what Bill and I found the next day. I've gone back and forth between thinking it was some kind of animal I'm not familiar with, or maybe even people from a nearby reservation performing some kind of ritual I don't understand. But deep down, I know neither of those explanations feels right. The bedding areas were too big, the paths too deliberate, and those knocking sounds. They were trying to communicate something. I started calling whatever it was sassy as a joke to myself, trying to make light of it. But honestly, I'm still unsettled by the whole experience. The logical part of my brain wants to dismiss it, but I can't. Lloyd and Davis want to use the same cabin for our hunt next year. Bill's non-committal and I'm conflicted. Part of me wants to go back to see if it happens again, maybe set up some trail cameras this time. Another part of me thinks that's a terrible idea. One thing's for sure, I'll never look at remote cabins the same way again. And whenever I'm near old settlements or graveyards now, I find myself listening more carefully and keeping my rifle just a little bit closer. Not because I think I'd use it, but because having it there makes me feel less vulnerable. Sometimes at night, when I'm almost asleep, I think I hear those knocks again. 3 quick ones, then 2 more after a pause. Rhythm like that doesn't happen in nature by accident. Whatever was out there that night was intelligent. It was trying to tell us something, and I still don't know what. Story 11. Ne-ti-ti. I've always considered myself a rational person. I'm not one to get spooked by ghost stories or strange noises in the night. At least that was true until what happened last January in the woods behind my house in Ravencrest. It's been 8 months, and I still haven't been able to shake the feeling that something was out there watching us, following us, and I don't know, maybe even toying with us. So I live about half a mile from the edge of this massive forest area. There are trails everywhere, game trails, paths that dog mushers use in winter, cross-country ski tracks. I've walked these woods since I was a kid, know them like the back of my hand. Never had a single problem, not even when I'd go alone. That night, 3 of my buddies, Warren, Josh, and Tyler, were over at my place. We were bored out of our minds doing the usual video game marathon. Around 10 at night, I suggested we take a walk on the trails. It was mid-January, cold, but not unbearable, maybe around 15 degrees. The moon was nearly full, bright enough that we didn't even need flashlights once our eyes adjusted. The snow reflected so much light that you could see almost as well as during twilight. Seriously, Dylan, a midnight hike in January? Tyler had said, but I could tell he was getting restless too. We'd been cooped up for hours. It didn't take much convincing. We bundled up, thick coats, gloves, hats, the whole winter gear set up, and headed out around 11. The plan was simple: walk out to the big wooden bridge about 2 miles in, then loop back home. We figured we'd be gone maybe 2 hours tops. The first part of the hike was normal, peaceful even. The snow crunched under our boots, our breath clouding in front of us. We were talking about stupid stuff, the kinds of conversations you have to pass time. Warren had recently gone down some YouTube rabbit hole about skinwalkers and was telling us these creepy stories. I remember Josh telling him to shut up because it was freaking him out. We all laughed about it. When we got to the bridge, we stopped for a few minutes to rest. The bridge crosses over this small creek that doesn't completely freeze even in winter. You could hear the water trickling underneath the ice. It was serene. We must have been there for maybe 15 minutes before deciding to head back. It was probably around midnight by then. That's when things started to feel off. First, we heard dogs barking in the distance. Not unusual on its own. There are houses scattered around the outer edges of the woods, and people keep sled dogs. But this wasn't normal barking. It was frantic, almost panicked. All of us noticed it immediately. "Those dogs sound freaked out," Warren said, and something about the way he said it made the hairs on my neck stand up. We picked up our pace a bit, not running, but definitely walking faster. About 10 minutes later, I remembered something that had happened earlier on our way to the bridge that hadn't registered as important at the time. "Hey, Warren, did you slip in the snow earlier? Like when we were about half a mile into the trail?" Warren looked at me weird. "No, why? I could have sworn I heard someone fall behind me. Sounded like someone's feet going out from under them in the snow." Josh and Tyler both said they hadn't slipped either. We all stopped walking and went quiet. That's when we first noticed it, the sound of movement in the woods to our right, maybe 30 feet off the trail. Branches cracking, snow crunching under weight. We stood completely still, listening. The sounds stopped too. After a few seconds of silence, we started walking again. The sounds resumed, keeping pace with us. "It's probably just a moose," Tyler said, but he didn't sound convinced. Moose don't follow people. We picked up our pace again. Whatever it was picked up its pace too. We slowed down. It slowed down. Then the snowballs started. The first one hit a tree about 5 feet to my left. At first, I thought it was just snow falling from branches. It happens all the time. But then another one landed right in front of Josh, then another behind Tyler. "What the hell?" Josh whispered. "Is someone messing with us?" We stopped and looked around. There was nothing but trees and darkness beyond the moonlit trail. The snowballs weren't being thrown hard enough to hurt, but with scary accuracy, like whatever was throwing them was deliberately missing us, but wanted to make sure we knew it was there. "Hello?" Warren called out. His voice sounded thin in the cold air. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then another snowball landed at our feet. That's when we collectively decided to jog. Not a full-on sprint, but a steady pace that would get us back quicker. Our breathing got heavier, creating larger clouds of vapor in the freezing air. The whole time, I could hear something moving parallel to us, just out of sight. Breaking branches, the sound of snow compacting under significant weight. What really got to me was how it moved. The snow off the trail was deep, like 5 feet deep in some spots. A person would struggle to move through it, would be making tons of noise, practically swimming through snow. But whatever this was, moved too smoothly, too quietly for how big it sounded. We were about a mile from the edge of the woods when the dogs started barking again, closer this time, like they were reacting to something near them. We all slowed to catch our breath for a second. That's when we heard it. About 20 feet to our right, something large moved through the brush, not trying to be stealthy anymore. Branches snapped like twigs. Then more snow came flying through the air, landing all around us. "Run!" I don't even know which one of us yelled it, maybe all of us. We sprinted the rest of the way. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs burned from the cold air. I didn't look back, didn't want to see what might be there. The sounds of pursuit seemed to fade as we got closer to the tree line, but none of us slowed down until we burst out onto the road near my neighborhood. We stood there gasping for breath, looking back at the dark wall of trees. Nothing emerged. Nothing visible anyway. I checked my phone. It was 3:15 in the morning. What should have been a 2-hour trip had taken over 4 hours. How was that possible? It didn't feel like we were out there that long. Even after we got back to my house, I couldn't relax. While my friends crashed in the living room, I went back outside and walked around the neighborhood for nearly an hour, just to make sure nothing had followed us home. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling watched. The next day in the daylight, we tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was some local kids messing with us. But the deep snow made that impossible. Anyone walking off trail would leave obvious tracks, and they'd be struggling to move, not keeping pace with us effortlessly. A moose or bear. Animals don't throw snowballs. And besides, bears hibernate in winter. What still bothers me the most is that it felt deliberate, like whatever it wasn't trying to hurt us. It was testing us, studying our reactions, playing with us almost. I've gone back into those woods dozens of times since then, but only during daylight. I've searched for any sign of what was out there. Tracks, broken branches, anything. I've never found a single piece of evidence to explain what happened that night. My friends and I don't talk about it much anymore. Josh actually gets angry when I bring it up. Warren's convinced it was a skinwalker or something similar. Tyler tries to explain it away as mass hysteria, says we freaked ourselves out after Warren's stories. But I know what I heard, what I felt. Something was out there. Sometimes at night, I stand at my bedroom window and look out toward the forest. I can't see the trails from my house, but I know they're there, winding through the trees. And sometimes I swear I can feel something looking back at me from the darkness between those trees. I don't walk those trails at night anymore, not ever. I can't shake the feeling that if I did, whatever was out there might not be content just to throw snowballs and keep its distance next time. Last week, I was taking out the trash after dark, and I heard dogs barking in that same panicked way from the edge of the forest. I went inside immediately and locked every door and window in my house. Call me crazy if you want. I would have 8 months ago. But something was out there in those woods, something intelligent enough to throw objects with accuracy, something large enough to move through deep snow with ease, something patient enough to follow 4 grown men for miles without ever fully revealing itself. And the worst part? I think it's still out there waiting. Story 12. I never thought I'd be sharing this. For years, I kept it to myself because honestly, who the hell would believe me? But after reading some of the accounts here, I realize I'm not alone. Maybe putting this down will help me process what happened during my years in Alaska. Even now, living back in Minnesota, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear something outside my window. It was the mid-90s when I moved up to Alaska's Copper River Basin after my divorce from Karen. 22 years of marriage down the drain, and I just needed to get away from everything. The property was dirt cheap, 40 acres of dense woodland bordered by state forest land as far as the eye could see. No neighbors for miles. Just what I wanted. The cabin I built wasn't fancy, just a one-bedroom affair with a main living area, kitchen, and a small bathroom. No grid electricity meant I was running everything off a generator and solar panels. It was basic, but it was mine. I had my wood stove for heat, a propane refrigerator, and enough shelf-stable food to last through the harsh winters. The first few years were exactly what I needed. I'd wake up with the sun, tend to my small garden, chop wood, hunt, fish, and basically live off the land as much as possible. I'd make monthly trips into the nearest town for supplies, but otherwise it was just me and the wilderness. I saw the usual wildlife, moose wandering through occasionally, black bears in the distance, and I'd hear wolves howling at night. Nothing unusual. That changed during my 5th year. It was early spring, still plenty of snow on the ground. I was checking my property line after a late season snowfall when I noticed them. Tracks crossing from the state land onto my property. At first I thought maybe another person had wandered through, but when I got closer I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. These weren't normal human footprints. They were bare feet, but massive, much bigger than my size 11 boots. And they sank deep into the snow, deeper than my own tracks, suggesting whatever made them was heavy. I followed them for about a quarter mile until they disappeared back into the state forest. When I mentioned it to some locals during my next supply run, they just laughed it off. Probably just a bear walking funny, said the guy at the general store, but I knew bear tracks. These were clearly feet with 5 toes, just scaled up to an impossible size. I mostly forgot about it until that fall. I had a decent-sized garden, surrounded by 4-foot wire fencing to keep the critters out. One morning I went out to harvest some vegetables and found the whole thing destroyed. Plants pulled up, partially eaten, and tossed around. What really got me was the fencing. It was bent inward from the top, like something tall and heavy had just pushed it down to get in. Not broken through, mind you, methodically bent at the top. That winter passed without incident, but the following summer is when things really started happening. I was out chopping wood near my storage shed one July afternoon. It was a hot day by Alaska standards, probably in the high 70s, and I had worked up a good sweat. I paused to drink some water when I felt it, that unmistakable feeling of being watched. I scanned the tree line and nearly dropped my canteen. About 60 yards away, just inside the forest edge, stood something I still have trouble describing. It was tall, way taller than me, and I'm 6 feet even, broad shoulders, much wider than a normal man, and covered in dark brown. I guess you'd call it hair, not fur. What struck me was its proportions. The arms hung lower than they should, almost to the knees. It was just standing there, watching me, not moving. We locked eyes for what felt like minutes, but was probably just seconds. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think clearly. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Then it simply took a step back and was gone. No crashing through the underbrush, no sound at all. Just gone, like a shadow melting into the trees. I didn't sleep well that night, or the next. I kept the Winchester propped by my bed and jumped at every sound. About 3 weeks later, I was outside my cabin skinning a rabbit I'd caught. Again, that feeling of being watched crept over me. This time I didn't see anything, but I heard it. Heavy movement through the woods, branches breaking under significant weight. Whatever it was circled around the clearing where my cabin stood, never showing itself, but making just enough noise to let me know it was there. Then came the night in August that still makes my skin crawl. I was inside reading by oil lamp when something hit the outside wall of my cabin. Not like a branch falling or an animal accidentally bumping into it. It was deliberate, 3 distinct slaps against the wood siding, then silence, except for what sounded like heavy breathing just outside my window. I grabbed my rifle, but couldn't bring myself to open the door. I just sat there, in the dark, waiting for whatever might happen next. Nothing did. At least not that night. But in the morning, When I finally worked up the courage to go outside, I found what looked like a handprint on the siding. It was about 6 feet up from the ground and much larger than my own hand. It wasn't clear like a print you'd make with paint, more like a dirty smudge with the unmistakable shape of fingers and a palm. After that, small incidents started happening more frequently. My neatly stacked firewood pile would be knocked over, not like it had fallen from being stacked poorly, but like something had deliberately pushed through the middle of it. I'd hear unusual howls at night, not wolves, not coyotes, but something different. Sometimes they'd come from multiple directions, like there was more than one. That winter, I had another clear sighting. I was coming back from checking a trap line when I spotted it across a small hill about 50 yards away. This time, I got a better look. It stood upright, completely bipedal, with that same dark brown hair covering its body. It watched me for a moment before moving off through the trees. The snow was about 2 feet deep at that point, and I rushed over to where it had been standing. The tracks were unmistakable, barefoot about 17 inches long and sinking much deeper than my booted prints right next to them. I started noticing other things around my property too. Trees, not small saplings but decent-sized ones, 3 or 4 inches thick, snapped at about 5 to 6 feet high. Not cut, not chewed by beavers, but snapped and twisted. They almost seemed to form boundaries around certain areas of my property. There was one incident that still gives me chills. I was inside my cabin when I heard movement from the north side of my clearing. As I was listening, I heard more movement from the east side. 2 different directions simultaneously. They were coordinating, communicating somehow without making any sounds I could detect. The following spring, something happened that convinced me these weren't just wild animals. I had a small chicken coop with 6 hens. Nothing fancy, just enough to give me fresh eggs. One morning, I went out to find the door open and 3 chickens missing. The door wasn't broken or forced open. The metal latch had been carefully lifted. A bear or wolverine would have smashed through. Whatever took my chickens had fingers and the intelligence to work a simple mechanism. By this point, I'd been on the property for nearly 8 years. The encounters had become almost routine, though no less unsettling. I never felt directly threatened, but I always felt watched, like I was the one in the zoo enclosure, being observed. My health started giving me trouble around this time. Blood pressure issues that needed more regular medical care than I could get in such a remote location. I reluctantly decided it was time to move back to the lower 48. About a month before I left, I had my final encounter. I was sitting on my porch one evening, watching the sunset and thinking about all that had happened there. Movement caught my eye at the tree line, about 100 yards away. It stepped out just enough for me to see its full height, easily 7 feet tall, with those distinctive long arms and broad shoulders. But it didn't come any closer. It just stood there, watching me. Almost like it knew I was leaving and wanted one last look. I raised my hand in a sort of half-wave, not really knowing why. To my shock, it raised its arm too, mirroring my gesture before turning and disappearing into the trees for the last time. I sold the property a year later to a hunting outfitter who wanted to turn it into a lodge. I never told him about my experiences. About 6 months after he bought it, he called me asking if I'd ever noticed anything unusual on the property. I just said no and changed the subject. I still think about those years in Alaska all the time, about what I saw in those woods. I've read about Bigfoot and Sasquatch encounters since then, and so many details match up with what I experienced. The size, the behavior, the tree structures, the footprints. It all fits. Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried to get evidence, a picture, a plaster cast of the prints, something. But honestly, in those moments, documentation was the last thing on my mind. And part of me is glad I didn't. Whatever was watching me during those years, seemed content to observe from a distance, to share the land without confrontation. I think trying to prove its existence might have changed that relationship, so that's my story. I don't expect everyone to believe it, and that's fine. I know what I saw. I know what was out there in those woods, and sometimes on quiet nights, I still get that feeling of being watched, even though I'm thousands of miles away now. Old habits die hard, I guess. Story 13. I've never told this story outside of my immediate family, but after finding this community, I feel like maybe it's time to share. This happened back in the summer of 2019, when my daughter Emily and I were on what was supposed to be just a normal road trip through Alaska. We'd been planning it for a couple years. I'd always wanted to drive the Alcan Highway, and Emily had just graduated high school, so it seemed like the perfect father-daughter trip before she headed off to college. We were driving my F-250 pickup, hauling our 27-foot travel trailer. Nothing fancy, just comfortable enough for the two of us and our gear. We'd been on the road for about 2 weeks by this point and had crossed from Canada into Alaska the day before. The border crossing had been pretty uneventful, just the usual questions about firearms and what we were bringing in. That morning we'd gotten an early start. The weather was perfect, sunny, about 65 degrees, not a cloud in the sky. We were headed westbound toward Tok on a pretty deserted stretch of highway. I remember checking the time on the dashboard, and it was just past 11 a.m. We were roughly 30 to 45 minutes past the U.S. Customs Station at the Alaska-Canada border. The landscape around us was absolutely beautiful, rolling green forests of spruce and birch trees on both sides of the highway. Emily was scrolling through her phone trying to find a good playlist, and I was just enjoying the drive. We hadn't seen another car for at least 20 minutes. I've driven through lots of wilderness before, but there was something different about Alaska. Everything feels bigger there, more untamed. The forests seem deeper, the mountains taller. You get this sense that humans are just visitors passing through. We came to this slight bend in the road where the trees thinned out a bit on the left side. I wasn't even looking for wildlife or anything. Usually Emily's the one who spots animals first. But something caught my eye inside the tree line. At first glance, I thought it was maybe a tree stump or possibly a moose. But then I noticed movement, and that's what made me really focus on it. Something was reaching upward into one of the birch trees. I hit the brakes pretty hard, enough that Emily looked up from her phone and asked what was wrong. The trailer pushed a bit behind us, but we came to a full stop right in the middle of the highway. Like I said, we hadn't seen another car in at least 20 minutes, so I wasn't worried about blocking traffic. "Dad, what are you doing?" Emily asked. I didn't answer right away because I was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. About 60 to 70 feet away, inside the tree line, I could clearly see something. It had auburn or blonde-colored fur. Not true blonde like human hair, more like a cinnamon color, I guess. And it was standing completely upright inside the tree line. My first thought was bear, but as I stared at it, I knew it wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. This thing had wide, muscular shoulders that tapered down to a narrower waist. Bears don't have that body shape. They're bulky all over. And its arms, God, its arms were so long compared to its body. "Emily," I said, my voice coming out much steadier than I felt. "Grab the camera. Right now." She must have heard something in my voice because she didn't question me. She just reached for the camera we kept in the center console. I unbuckled my seatbelt and opened the door, my eyes never leaving the figure in the trees. The creature's fur looked surprisingly clean and shiny, not matted or dirty, like you'd expect from a wild animal. It seemed to be about 4 inches long all over its body. But the most unsettling thing was its build. It looked human-like in structure, but much, much larger and broader. And its head, this detail has stuck with me ever since. Its head sat directly on its shoulders. No neck, Not like it didn't have one, but like the neck was so thick and muscular that it blended right into the shoulders. Its right arm was reaching high overhead, grabbing at something in the birch tree, maybe leaves or checking a nest, I couldn't tell. But the reach was incredible, effortless, like someone picking an apple but reaching 12 feet up. By the time I got out of the truck and Emily joined me with the camera, the creature was gone, vanished. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 15 to 20 seconds, but it felt much longer. "What was it, Dad?" Emily asked, camera in hand, looking confused. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but it wasn't a bear." We stood there for a minute, both of us scanning the tree line. The silence was what got to me the most. Whatever that thing was, it had disappeared into the forest without making a sound. No cracking branches, no rustling leaves. Just gone. Something that big shouldn't be able to move so silently. After a few minutes, I told Emily to wait in the truck while I walked a little closer to where I'd seen it. I didn't go all the way into the trees. To be honest, I was too freaked out. But I went maybe 15 feet from the road. The ground was soft and covered with pine needles and moss. I looked for footprints but couldn't find anything definitive. There were some broken branches on the birch tree where I'd seen it reaching, but that was about it. I went back to the truck and we continued driving. Neither of us said much for the next 20 minutes or so. I kept replaying the sighting in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen, but I couldn't come up with any explanation that made sense. About 10 miles down the road, we came to a roadside pull-off with an informational sign about the local wildlife. I pulled over and we got out. I needed to try to make sense of what we'd seen. "Emily," I said, "remember that birch tree where the thing was reaching up?" She nodded. "Let's find a similar one and do a little measuring." We found a birch tree at the edge of the pull-off that looked about the same size as the one I'd seen earlier. I got the tape measure from my toolbox in the truck bed, and we did some estimating. I'm 6'2", and when I reached as high as I could, I topped out at about 8 feet. The creature I'd seen was reaching effortlessly way higher than that. Based on the height of the birch tree and where it had been reaching, I estimated it had to be at least 9 feet tall, maybe taller, with an overhead reach of at least 12 feet. The implications of this hit me hard. I've been hunting all my life. I know what a bear looks like when it stands up. I know what a moose looks like from every angle. This wasn't either of those. "Dad," Emily said quietly, "do you think it was a Sasquatch?" I didn't answer right away. I've always been a practical person. I believe in what I can see, touch, and verify. Before this trip, if someone had told me they saw Bigfoot, I would have nodded politely while thinking they were either mistaken or making it up. "I don't know what to call it," I finally said, "but it wasn't a bear or a moose or any other animal I'm familiar with." We got back in the truck and continued our trip, but something had changed. I found myself scanning the tree lines constantly. Every shadow in the forest made me tense up. I couldn't shake the image of that creature from my mind. The proportions, the clean fur, the way it moved. We stopped for lunch at a small diner in Tok a couple hours later. While Emily was in the bathroom, I mentioned the sighting to our waitress, trying to sound casual. "Oh, you're not the first," she said matter-of-factly, refilling my coffee. "Bunch of truckers have stories from that stretch. Management at the diner doesn't like us talking about it, though. Scares off the tourists." She walked away before I could ask her anything else, and when Emily came back, I didn't mention the conversation. That night, we stayed at a campground outside of Fairbanks. As we sat by our small campfire, Emily asked me, "Are we going to tell Mom about what we saw?" I poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the darkening sky. "Do you think she'd believe us?" Emily shrugged. "Probably not. I barely believe it myself, and I was there." "That's the thing," I said. "I know what I saw, but I also know how it sounds when you try to explain it to someone else." We ended up telling my wife when we got home, And as expected, she thought we'd seen a bear and just misjudged its size and appearance. Maybe that's what I would have thought too, if I hadn't been there. The thing that still bothers me the most, even now, 4 years later, is how something that large could disappear so quickly and quietly. I've spent a lot of time in the woods throughout my life. I know how much noise humans make moving through underbrush, even when we're trying to be quiet. Whatever this creature was, it moved through that forest like it was made of smoke. I've spent countless hours since that day researching similar sightings in Alaska. There are more than you might think, especially along the highways that cut through the wilderness. Many descriptions match what I saw: the proportions, the ability to move silently, the clean fur. I've never gone public with this story until now. I'm not looking for fame or attention. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm just sharing what I saw that summer morning on a deserted stretch of Alcan Highway. I don't know if it was a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or something else entirely. What I do know is that it wasn't any known animal I'm familiar with, and it certainly wasn't a person in a costume. We were in the middle of nowhere, and this thing was over 9 feet tall with proportions no human could match. Sometimes, when I'm driving through wooded areas near my home in Montana, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that figure again, and I always keep a camera within reach now, just in case. Emily's in her senior year of college now. She's studying wildlife biology, and I sometimes wonder if what we saw that day influenced her choice of major. We don't talk about the sighting much anymore, but occasionally, when she's home on break and we're driving somewhere together, she'll suddenly say, "Remember Alaska?" And I know exactly what she's thinking about. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. I probably wouldn't have believed it myself if someone had told it to me before that summer, but I know what I saw, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the wild places where humans rarely go. And sometimes, if you're lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, you might catch a glimpse of them and know. Story 14. I've been debating whether to post this for years. I've read so many of your stories here, and I guess I finally need to get this off my chest. This happened in the spring of 2008, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My boyfriend Thomas and I had been dating for about 3 years, and he surprised me with a helicopter tour over the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee for my birthday. I'd always wanted to see the mountains from above, and Thomas knew I was obsessed with wildlife photography. Not that I was any good at it, but Thomas had just dropped a small fortune on this fancy DSLR camera with an incredible zoom lens. He was so proud of that thing, carried it everywhere. We showed up at this small private airfield where we met our pilot, Harold. He was probably in his 60s, leather-faced with this wild white hair sticking out from under his cap. You could tell he'd been flying these mountains forever. He had that easy confidence of someone who knows the area like the back of his hand. "You folks picked a good day," Harold told us as we climbed into the helicopter. "Weather's perfect, and the animals are active this time of year." The helicopter was smaller than I'd expected, just enough room for the 3 of us. Thomas sat up front with Harold, and I was in the back. As we lifted off, my stomach did this weird flip, and I gripped the edge of my seat. I'd never been in a helicopter before. About 20 minutes into the tour, after seeing some incredible views of waterfalls and ridges, Harold's voice came through our headsets. "Hey folks, I'm gonna take us a bit off the usual path. Might give us a better chance to spot some wildlife. Between you and me, it's technically a restricted flying zone, but I know what I'm doing. Been flying here 30 years. I exchanged looks with Thomas, who just shrugged and smiled. That was Thomas, always up for an adventure. We veered away from the normal tourist spots and headed deeper into the mountains. The forest below became denser, the terrain more rugged. It was beautiful, but somehow more primal. That's not quite the right word, but there was something different about this part of the mountains. "Not many people come out this way," Harold said. "Too remote, no hiking trails, no roads, pure wilderness." I was staring out the window, hoping to spot a bear or maybe some elk, when Harold suddenly went quiet. The helicopter slowed, then began circling an area. "What the hell is that?" I heard him mutter through the headset. I pressed my face against the window, and that's when I saw it. In a small clearing nestled between two ridges was what looked like, I don't even know how to describe it properly, structures. Not modern buildings, but not quite primitive either. They were arranged in a circular pattern, maybe 7 or 8 of them. They looked like they were made from timber and stones, partially camouflaged by the surrounding forest. "Is that some kind of historical site?" Thomas asked, already pulling out his camera. Harold shook his head. "Not on any map I've ever seen." As we circled lower, I noticed movement. At first, I thought it was just shadows from the trees, but then I saw them clearly. They moved between the structures with this unnatural speed, like nothing I've ever seen before. They were big, really big, and covered in what looked like dark reddish-brown hair. "Holy shit," Thomas whispered, his camera clicking rapidly. There were at least 5 of them that I could see. They walked upright, but not like humans. There was something fluid about their movements, almost like they glided, and they were fast, unnervingly fast. One moment they'd be by one structure, and the next they'd be somewhere completely different, as if they'd teleported. The biggest one, I swear it must have been 8 feet tall, suddenly stopped and looked up. Right at us. Even from that height, I felt like it was staring directly into my eyes. My entire body went cold. "They see us," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Harold immediately pulled the helicopter higher. "I don't like this at all." The creatures below were now all looking up. They didn't scatter or hide. They just watched. That's what unnerved me the most. They weren't afraid. One of them raised its arm, pointing at us. "Are they Sasquatch?" Thomas asked, still snapping photos. "I've been flying these mountains for decades," Harold replied, his voice tense. "Heard all the stories, never believed them, but I don't know what else those could be." We circled the area 3 more times. Thomas kept taking pictures, zooming in as much as possible. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me was screaming that we needed to leave. The way they moved, it wasn't natural. It was almost ghost-like. And despite being in a helicopter hundreds of feet above them, I had this irrational fear that they could somehow reach us. On our final pass, the largest creature did something that still haunts me. It stood perfectly still in the center of their village, and I swear it nodded at us. A deliberate, human-like gesture. Thomas captured it on camera. "That's enough," Harold finally said. "We're heading back." The flight back was mostly silent. We were all trying to process what we'd seen. Thomas kept reviewing the photos on his camera, his face pale. "These are incredible," he muttered. "You can see their faces in some of them." Harold cleared his throat. "Listen, what we saw back there, I don't know what it was, but maybe we should keep it quiet for now." But we didn't. That night, after we got back to our hotel, Thomas proposed to me. We were sitting on our balcony, still buzzing from what we'd witnessed, and he just pulled out a ring, said that sharing the most incredible moment of his life with me made him realize he wanted to share every moment with me. It was perfect, even if the timing was bizarre. High on our engagement and our discovery, we made a decision that I now regret. Thomas sent some of the best photos to a few major nature magazines and news outlets. We thought we'd made a groundbreaking discovery. Maybe we had. 3 days after we returned home, there was a knock on our door. 3 men in pressed suits claiming to be from National Geographic. They showed IDs, but I barely glanced at them. I was too excited. "We're very impressed with the photographs you sent us," the one who introduced himself as James said. His smile never reached his eyes. "We'd like to see all the photographs, if possible." Thomas eagerly invited them in, connecting his camera to our laptop. The men gathered around, asking questions about exactly where we'd been, who our pilot was, how long we'd stayed in the area. They seemed friendly enough at first, interested. "This is quite remarkable," James said, scrolling through the images. "Would you mind if we make copies of these files for our experts to analyze?" Of course we didn't mind. Thomas explained he had backups on his external hard drive and showed them where everything was stored. That's when their demeanor changed. The friendly veneer slipped away. "Mr. and Miss Jenkins," James said, though we weren't married yet, "we need to have a serious conversation about what you saw." They explained that what we had discovered was a protected species, and that releasing these images could cause a mass influx of people into a delicate ecosystem. They said the government had known about these creatures for decades, but kept them secret to protect them. While we were talking, I noticed one of the other men was doing something with our laptop. When I glanced over, I realized he was systematically deleting all the photos, not just from the computer, but from Thomas's camera and external drive. "What are you doing?" I jumped up, but James put his hand on my shoulder, pushing me firmly back into my seat. "Please understand, this is for the best. These creatures need to remain undocumented." Thomas tried to protest, but the third man, who hadn't spoken until then, leaned in close to him. "Let me be clear," he said quietly. "This isn't a debate. These photos never existed. Your helicopter tour went exactly as planned, with no detours. You saw some lovely scenery, maybe a few deer, nothing more." The threat wasn't explicit, but it hung in the air. These weren't journalists. I don't know who they were, but they had authority, and they were dangerous. Before they left, James turned to us. "You can tell your story. People have been talking about Bigfoot for generations. It's just another campfire tale without evidence. But these photos," he gestured to the now empty hard drive, "they never happened." After they left, Thomas and I sat in stunned silence. Our evidence was gone. Our incredible discovery had been erased in an afternoon. We were terrified. Who were these people? How did they find us so quickly? Were we in danger? We tried to talk to Harold the next day, but the helicopter tour company said he'd taken a sudden leave of absence. When we pressed for details, they became cagey. Eventually, they told us Harold no longer worked for them and they couldn't provide his contact information. For years, we told nobody. We were too scared. We got married that fall, and we moved a few times, always with this nagging fear that we were being watched. It's been over 15 years now, and I still don't know what we saw that day. Were they really Sasquatch? Some kind of undiscovered primate? Or something else entirely? I don't have answers. Just the memory of those creatures looking up at us, moving with that impossible speed, and that deliberate nod from their leader. What bothers me most is how quickly and efficiently we were silenced. These men knew exactly what to do, like they'd done it many times before. How many other people have seen something they shouldn't have, only to be visited and intimidated into silence? I realize now they only cared about the physical evidence. They let us keep our story because without proof, it's just another Bigfoot tale. That's why I'm finally sharing this. They took our evidence, but they can't take my memory of what I saw. I don't know if anyone will believe me. I barely believe it myself sometimes. But I know what we saw that spring day in 2008. A village of creatures that shouldn't exist, moving like ghosts through the mountains of Tennessee, and somewhere out there they're still watching. Story 15. I'm still not sure I should be typing this, but I've been carrying it around for 21 years now, and I need to tell someone who might actually believe me. My husband James and I haven't talked about it much since it happened, not even with each other. It's just one of those things that's too weird to bring up in normal conversation, you know. It was October 12th, 2002, our 4th wedding anniversary. James and I always celebrated our anniversaries camping. It was our thing. We both grew up loving the outdoors, And some of our first dates were hiking trips. When we got married, we promised we'd never become one of those couples who just goes to fancy restaurants for their anniversary. We wanted adventure. That year, we decided to camp outside Ashland, Oregon. I'd heard great things about the area from a co-worker who grew up nearby. She told me about this secluded campsite near a small lake that wasn't marked on most tourist maps. It's where the locals go, she said, totally peaceful, hardly anyone there in October. We arrived at the campsite around 3 in the afternoon. It was about a 45-minute drive from Ashland proper, down a bumpy Forest Service road that made me question if our Honda Civic could handle it. The campsite was perfect, though, exactly what we wanted. No official facilities, just a cleared area where people obviously camped, with a makeshift fire pit made of stones. The best part was that there wasn't another soul around. We spent the afternoon setting up our tent, gathering firewood, and exploring the immediate area. James found a trail that led down to the lake, which was maybe a 10-minute walk from our site. It wasn't a big lake. You could probably walk around the whole thing in less than an hour, but it was gorgeous, surrounded by pine trees with a small meadow on one side. After dinner, campfire, hot dogs and beans, our traditional first night meal, we were sitting by the fire when James suggested we walk down to the lake. The night was unusually clear for October in Oregon, and he thought we could do some stargazing. I remember checking my watch. It was just after 9, and thinking it wasn't too late for a short hike. We grabbed our fleece blanket, a thermos of hot chocolate, and James's backpack with a flashlight and some snacks. The trail to the lake was pretty easy to follow, even in the dark. There was a 3/4 moon out, so we could see well enough without using the flashlight. Plus, we wanted our eyes to adjust for stargazing. We found this perfect little hill overlooking the lake. It wasn't very high, but it gave us a clear view of both the water and the sky. We spread out our blanket, laid down, and just breathed in the night. The stars were unbelievable. Living near Portland, we never get to see the sky like that. The Milky Way was a bright smear across the darkness, and I swear I could see more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. I don't know exactly how long we were there, maybe an hour. James was pointing out constellations. He's always been better at identifying them than me. And we were sipping hot chocolate, just enjoying the moment. That's when I first noticed something moving at the edge of the lake. At first, I thought it might be deer coming for a drink. That would have been cool to see. But as my eyes focused, I realized these shapes were walking upright. My first thought was that other campers had arrived and were taking a late-night stroll. "James," I whispered, nudging him and pointing toward the lake's edge. "Do you see that?" He sat up and squinted in the direction I was pointing. There was a long pause, and I felt him tense beside me. "What the hell are those?" he whispered back. That's when I realized these weren't other campers. There were about 6 dark figures walking slowly along the shoreline, roughly 100 yards from where we sat. In the moonlight, I could only make out silhouettes, but something about them seemed wrong. They moved differently than people do. For what felt like forever, we just watched them, frozen in place. They seemed to be moving with purpose, not just wandering. I remember thinking they looked too big to be human, but my brain kept trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe they were bear hunters? Maybe it was some kind of prank? James squeezed my hand and made a small gesture indicating we should leave. That's when I realized 2 of the figures had separated from the group by the water. They had moved much closer to our position, maybe 30 yards away now. I hadn't even seen them move. One moment they were with the others, and then suddenly they were closer, like they'd teleported or something. They were standing still now, and even though I couldn't see their faces clearly, I could tell they were watching us. The way they held themselves was alert, heads slightly tilted like they were analyzing us, maybe trying to determine if we were a threat. I felt like a rabbit being sized up by a wolf. In the moonlight, I could see them better now. They weren't human, not even close. Their proportions were all wrong. They stood upright like men, but their bodies looked more like apes, with long arms that hung down past where their knees should be. But they weren't like any apes I'd seen in zoos or documentations either. They were somewhere in between, and that made them more terrifying somehow. One of them made a sound then, a series of clicks and grunts that sounded like gibberish to me, and the other responded with similar noises. They were communicating. I don't know why that detail scared me so much, but it did. Maybe because it meant they were intelligent. They weren't just animals acting on instinct. They were thinking, planning. Both creatures started sniffing the air, their heads moving in an arc as they drew in our scent. It reminded me of the way our neighbor's dog behaves when meeting a stranger, cautious, gathering information, deciding how to respond. I don't know what possessed James to do what he did next, but he reached into his backpack and pulled out his flashlight. Before I could stop him, he'd switched it on and pointed the beam directly at the two figures. The reaction was instant and terrifying. Both creatures made this awful hissing sound, exactly like angry cats, but much louder, much deeper. In the flashlight's beam, I could see their eyes reflecting the light, bright white, without any pupils I could detect. They both turned their heads away from the light, raising their arms to shield their faces. The beam also gave me a better view of what we were dealing with. Their skin looked leathery and dark, covered in what seemed like short fur or hair. What struck me most was that they didn't have necks. Their heads seemed to protrude directly from their chests, with powerful shoulders sloping up on either side. They were muscular, far more than any human bodybuilder, with barrel chests and thick, sturdy legs. James snapped off the flashlight, and I think that might have saved us. The creatures lowered their arms but remained agitated, shifting their weight from foot to foot. The group by the water's edge hadn't moved, but they all seemed to be facing our direction now, alerted by the commotion. "We need to go," James whispered, his voice shaking. "Slowly, don't run." We stood up carefully, leaving the blanket behind. I was too scared to bend down and pick it up. We started backing away toward the path that led back to our campsite, keeping our eyes on the creatures the whole time. They didn't charge at us or make any sudden moves, but the two closer ones began walking in our direction, matching our pace. They kept a constant distance between us, not getting closer, but not letting us increase the gap either. It was like they were escorting us away from their territory. I remember thinking they weren't hunting us, they were herding us. When we reached the tree line where the path started, the creatures stopped. They stood watching as we backed further into the trees. Once we were a good 20 yards down the path, James whispered, "Let's go." And we turned and walked quickly back toward our campsite, fighting the urge to run. I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified of seeing those things following us through the trees, but they never appeared. The walk back to camp felt 10 times longer than it had on the way to the lake. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made my heart jump into my throat. When we finally reached our campsite, we didn't even discuss what to do. We just started packing up our gear as quickly and quietly as possible. Neither of us wanted to spend another minute there. We didn't even take down the tent properly. We just yanked up the stakes, shoved it into its bag half folded, and threw everything into the car. The drive back to Ashland was silent at first. I think we were both processing what we'd seen, trying to make sense of it. About halfway back, James said, "Tell me what you saw." I think he wanted to make sure we'd seen the same thing, that one of us wasn't just imagining it. I described the creatures, their proportions, the way they moved, the sounds they made, their eyes in the flashlight beam, the lack of necks, their muscular bodies. James nodded the whole time, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Then he described exactly the same features. We hadn't imagined it. We hadn't exaggerated in our fear. We'd seen the same impossible things. We ended up checking into a motel in Ashland around midnight. I don't think either of us slept much that night. We spent the rest of our anniversary trip doing touristy things in town, never mentioning what happened at the lake, as if by silent agreement. A few days after we got home, I tried researching what we might have seen. I looked up local wildlife, thinking maybe we'd just seen some bears walking oddly in the moonlight, but nothing matched. I even looked into local legends and found some mentions of Bigfoot sightings in southern Oregon. But those descriptions didn't quite match either. Bigfoot is supposedly hairy all over, more like a gorilla, while these creatures had shorter hair, more like a deer or horse's coat. Over the years, I've occasionally wondered if I should report what we saw to someone. Park rangers, cryptozoologists, I don't know, but I never have. What would I say? Who would believe us? And honestly, part of me doesn't want to know what they were. Some mysteries might be better left unsolved. James and I still go camping, but we've never gone back to that area, and we always make sure we're at an established campground with other people nearby. We don't stargaze much anymore either. These days, we prefer to watch the stars from our back deck, safely behind a locked door. Sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I still hear those hissing sounds they made when the light hit their eyes. I still see those pupilless white eyes reflecting in the darkness. And I wonder if somewhere in the forests outside Ashland, those creatures are still there, walking along the lakeshore at night, watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting stargazers to wander too close to their territory. The thing that haunts me most isn't what they looked like or the sounds they made. It's the intelligence I sensed in them. They weren't mindless animals. They made decisions. They communicated. They escorted us away instead of attacking. Whatever they were, they thought about us as much as we thought about them. And sometimes I wonder, what did they decide about us that night? And what would they do if we ever returned?